The needle in the integration rig was reading past its own ceiling, and Surgeon Adept Ale Voss had stopped pretending the instrument was broken. He had recalibrated it twice already, once because the readout embarrassed him, once because his assistant had asked him to. In the flat, careful way assistants ask their superiors to correct their own mistakes. Both times the lattice map had climbed back to the same impossible line and held there, steady, patient, like a tide that had decided not to go out. On the far side of the observation glass, the subject sat on a padded bench with her hands loose in her lap, and she was watching the needle too. "Bring it down," Voss said, "the whole test bank. I want a cold baseline." His assistant, a young Sethiri named Alan, hesitated with all four hands over the console. "Adept, if we cold start the bank, the subject loses her orientation cue. She may. She won't fall. They always fall on a cold start. She won't." Voss did not know why he was so certain. He watched the human's face through the glass and found nothing there to justify the certainty, no tension, no bracing, none of the small animal signs a body made when it knew it was about to be dropped. She just breathed. "Do it." Alan killed the bank. Every reference field in the chamber went dark at once. The floor grid, the horizon line, the soft gravitational cue the Sethiri built into every rig because their own inner sense of down was delicate and easily fooled. For any of the four species Voss had augmented in this room, cutting those cues was a small cruelty. The body panicked, the gut lurched, the subject grabbed for the bench and held on and was sick afterward. It was standard. You broke the old balance so the new lattice could learn to carry the load. The human did not grab the bench. She tilted her head very slightly, the way a person tilts to catch a sound at the edge of hearing. Then she stood in the dark, on a floor that gave her no promise of being a floor, and she walked 4 unhurried steps to the observation glass and put one hand flat against it, and she looked through the reflection at the exact place where Voss was standing, as though the dark were an inconvenience she had already filed away. "Bank," Voss said very quietly. "Bring it back." Light returned. The human was standing where she should not have been able to stand, calm, one hand on the glass, and the needle behind Voss's shoulder was still pinned at the top of its range. "Adept," Alan whispered, "that's not integration, that's—" "I know what it is." Voss found that his own secondary lids had closed, the way they did when he was looking at something he did not want to have seen. He opened them. "Log it as a successful first phase calibration, nothing else, not one word past that." "But the overseer will want—" "The overseer will want a great many things," Voss said. "Log the phase. Send the subject back to her cell." Her designation on the manifest was Unit 9 Sable, which meant nothing except the order in which she had come off the border transport and the classification bracket of the world she had come off of. Sable was the Concord's ugliest bracket. It was the one they printed in a color you were supposed to feel in your teeth. A sable world was a place that killed its own children as a matter of routine and grew adults out of the ones it failed to kill. And the Meridian Augmentation Concord had spent the better part of a decade learning that sable stock took the lattice like nothing else in the catalog. Her name, which was not on any manifest, was Mara Quill, and she was 22 years old and she had been counting. She had counted the doors between the integration chamber and the cell block, 11, 4 of them with the heavy magnetic seals, 7 with the light ones the maintenance crews used. She had counted the guards and sorted them by species, because species told her how they moved, and how they moved told her where they could not go. She had counted the ceiling. Most of the people in Mara's life had never once counted a ceiling. They walked with their eyes level, and their sense of the world hanging off a plumb line dropped straight down from the tops of their heads, and it had never occurred to them that the plumb line was a decision, and not a law. The Sethiri surgeon had rebuilt the part of her that made that decision. She hadn't asked him to. She wanted to be very clear about that, in the part of herself that kept the ledger. She had woken up on the far side of a surgery she had not consented to, with a pressure behind both ears like the memory of a deep dive, and a new and absolute knowledge of where every surface in the room was, and which way each of them wanted to pull her. They had meant it as a product. They had a client somewhere, a shipping combine, a mining concern, some buyer who needed bodies that could work the outside of a hull in null gravity without vomiting or freezing or losing the horizon. A perfect sense of balance, grown into a deathworlder frame that could take the augmentation without rejecting it. That was the merchandise. That was the whole idea. The idea had one flaw, and Mara had found it on her first night in the cell, when she'd woken in the dark and realized the wall beside her bunk did not feel like a wall. It felt like a floor she happened to be standing next to. If she put her weight against it correctly, if she trusted the new thing behind her ears the way she had learned in one violent afternoon to trust it, the wall would hold her, and the floor would become the wall, and down would be wherever she needed it to be. She had spent that first night walking the four walls of a cell built to hold a floor-bound thing. She had put her palm flat on the ceiling, and she had lain back down on her bunk before the shift count came around, and she had not told anyone, and she had gone on counting. It integrated, the overseer said, fully. First phase, Voss said. There is a great deal of difference between first phase and fully. I would counsel against. You would counsel. Overseer Neth Calorum did not raise his voice. He never did. He was of the virile, slate-skinned and tall and built along vertical lines, and he had the virile gift for making a room feel like a ledger in which you were a figure that had not yet been reconciled. He stood at the tall window of the administration tier with the whole of the loom curving away below him. The Meridian Concord's flagship refit station. A wheel of white galleries turning slowly against the daylit face of the planet it orbited. All of it bright, all of it clean, none of it as clean as it looked. Adept, do you know what the Farron Combine is paying for a proven null-gravity labor line? Not a prototype. A line. 10 units to start, 40 on option. I know the figure. Then you know why first phase is a word I would prefer you not use in front of the client's factor when he arrives on the 11th. Calorum turned. His eyes were the color of wet slate. You built something extraordinary, Adept. I have read your integration log. I have also read the parts of it your assistant filed that you told him not to. A cold start ambulation on the first calibration. No prior species in this facility has done that inside 6 phases. Some never do it at all. Voss said nothing. He was aware, distantly, of having made a mistake somewhere upstream, of having trusted a young assistant to be loyal to a surgeon over a system, when the system signed the young assistant's certifications. I want her advanced, Calorum said. Second phase by the end of the cycle. I want the factor to watch her walk the outside of a test frame in null, and I want him to write a number on a slate that makes the Farron Combine's number look like a deposit. Can you do that? I can advance the calibration safely, yes. I didn't ask about safely. The overseer smiled, which on a virile was a horizontal thing, humorless and administrative. But do it your way. I've learned it's cheaper to let the surgeons be precious. Just have her ready. He turned back to the window and the bright turning galleries. An Adept, the sable stock. I've authorized a second acquisition off the same corridor. They'll process through in a few days. If this line performs, we widen it. You'll have more of them than you know what to do with. Voss left the administration tier with the pressure of the word more sitting behind his own secondary lids, and he did not examine, yet, why it should feel like a hand closing. The second phase calibration was where the Concord usually lost the weaker subjects, and Voss ran it the way he ran everything, which was slowly, with too many instruments, in a voice that gave nothing away. He had the human brought to the large frame chamber, a spherical test volume 40 meters across, its inner surface a lattice of structural ribs and handholds and mag rail, its gravity tunable from full down to nothing at all. It was where the Concord proved a null gravity line. Around the equator of the sphere ran a gallery of observation booths, and Voss put the human in the center of the volume at a quarter gravity, and watched her decide what to do with a world that had almost stopped telling her which way to fall. She did not thrash. That was the first thing he wrote down. Every other species thrashed at quarter G. The body kept issuing corrections for a gravity that was no longer there, and the corrections became tumbling, and the tumbling became the sickness. The human drifted to the nearest rib, set one hand and one foot against it, and stopped. Simply stopped, folded against the structure like she'd been grown there, her sense of down evidently reassigned to the rib itself in the time it took Voss to note the moment. "Quarter to eighth," he said. The gravity halved. The human adjusted the pressure of her hand and did not otherwise move. "Eighth to null." Alan, beside him, had stopped breathing in the shallow, rapid way he breathed when he was frightened, and had started breathing not at all. In null gravity, 40 meters of empty volume is a killing thing for a mind that has spent its life at the bottom of a well. There is no down to organize the panic around, so the panic has nowhere to go and fills everything. Voss had watched strong Kesh guards weep in this chamber. He had watched a four-armed scholar of his own species, a man of great composure, come apart into a small curled shape and have to be retrieved with a line. The human pushed off the rib. She crossed the whole volume in a single clean glide, 40 meters, arms loose, and she did not tumble, and she did not spin, and when she reached the far wall she met it with both feet already turned to take it as a floor, and she stood on the inside of the sphere with the entire chamber hanging over her head like a sky she had decided to ignore. Then she walked. She walked along the inner curve of the sphere in null gravity, one deliberate step after another, her feet finding the ribs and the handholds, her balance reassigning down to whatever surface her weight was on, until she had walked a quarter of the way around the world and stood at a right angle to where she had started, looking across the empty center at the observation booth where two Sethiri stood with their instruments forgotten in their hands. "Adept," Alan said, in a voice like a man reading his own name off a casualty list. "She's walking in null." "Yes." "That isn't balance. Balance doesn't do that. There's nothing to balance against. There's no—" He stopped. "How is she walking?" Voss watched the small, distant figure take another step along the inside of a world, unbothered, procedural, as though the impossibility were a floor, and she had merely declined to be impressed by it. "She isn't balancing against the gravity," Voss said slowly, understanding it as he said it. "We took the gravity away and she kept the reference. She's balancing against the structure, against the whole shape of the room at once." He set his instrument down. "We built her a new sense of down, and she looked at it and decided down was optional." Below them, in the center of the great bright sphere, Mara Quill finished her walk around the inside of the world and stopped, and turned her head and found the observation glass again. Found it the way she had found it in the dark on the first day, unerring level. And she looked at the surgeon who had rebuilt her, and she did not smile, and she did not plead, and she filed him, the way she filed everything, and went on counting. The factor came on the 11th. His name was Sesh Farinalo, a mid-tier functionary of the Farron shipping combine, cephalopod descended, mottled gray, with the boneless, deliberate movements of a species that had learned confidence in deep water. He arrived with 2 aides and a slate, and the particular impatience of a man who has been sent to confirm a purchase his superiors have already emotionally made, and merely wishes not to have his afternoon wasted. Calorum met him at the gallery and walked him along the bright curve of the equatorial booths with a host's ease, and Voss walked a pace behind and said as little as the arrangement would allow. Below them the human floated at the center of the null sphere, waiting in a plain gray subject shift, her brown hair drifting around her face in the absence of gravity, her hands at rest. "That's the deathworlder," Farinalo said. "It was not a question. Small." "They run small on Sable," Calorum said. It's part of why the stock takes the lattice so well. Low mass, high adaptation. Watch. He gave the signal, and Voss, because it was his hand on the instruments and no one else's, ran the demonstration he had spent a night designing to be both true and survivable. He put the human through the frame. He had her cross the volume, stand on the inner wall, walk the curve, brace at a hardpoint, hold a load line, move a test mass along a rail, the whole vocabulary of null-gravity hull work. All the things the Farron Combine needed a body to do on the outside of a ship, where a single lost horizon meant a lost worker, and a lost worker meant a claim. She did each of them the way a competent person does a task they find neither difficult nor interesting. The Factor watched. His mottled skin shifted through two colors Voss couldn't read. His aides made notes, and when the human, at the end of the sequence, planted herself on the inner wall of the sphere and stood there upside down relative to the booth, calm, waiting for the next instruction that Voss had not yet given, the Factor leaned toward the glass and was quiet for a long moment. "Do that again," he said, "the walk on the wall slowly." Voss gave the instruction. The human walked slow along the inside of the world. "She's not using the mag rail," Farinello said. "No," Voss said, "she doesn't need it. Every line I've ever bought needs the rail. The rail is the product. You clip to the rail and the rail holds your feet and you do your work and you don't think about the drop because the rail has already thought about it for you." The Factor's skin went a flat, expensive gray. "She's not clipped to anything. She's just walking on the inside of a sphere, in null." He turned to Calorum. "How is she doing that?" "Adaptation," Calorum said smoothly. "Deathworlder stock. Her own balance carries her. No rail, no clip, no failure point. Think of the claims you don't file. Think of the insurance line." "I'm thinking of it." Farinello's aides were both writing quickly now. "I'm thinking your line just made every rail-clipped labor contract in the Reach look like a liability." He looked back down at the small figure standing serene on the wrong side of the world. 10 to start was the number I brought. It's not the number I'm leaving with, but I want the whole line built to her, to that." He tapped the glass with one boneless finger over the human's small, far shape. "That exactly. Whatever she is, I want 40 of it." "You'll have it," Calorum said. Voss, standing a pace behind, watching the human wait on the inside of the world for an instruction, understood two things at once, cleanly, the way you understand a fracture. The first was that the overseer had already decided to cut her open again. Not to advance her, she was past advancing. To study her. To find the thing in a sable body that let a mind keep its reference when the reference was gone, and to reproduce it 40 times, 60, however many bodies the corridor would give them. The second was that the human, floating quiet at the center of the great bright sphere with her hair adrift around her calm and ordinary face, had heard every word. The observation glass was not soundproofed on the subject's side. It never had been. It had never mattered before, because no subject had ever been in a condition to do anything with what they heard. She looked up through the glass once at the exact place where the Factor's boneless finger still rested over her shape, and then she looked at Voss. He was the only one who saw it, because he was the only one looking at her face and not at the number the Factor was writing. She looked at Voss, and something in her level ordinary expression settled, the way a decision settles, the way a needle settles when it has finally found the true reading and means to hold there. Then she went back to waiting and gave nothing else away, and the Factor and the overseer shook on a number that would build a line of 40 deathworlders, and none of them but Voss had noticed that the merchandise had just finished counting. The second acquisition came through the border corridor 2 days after the Factor left, and Voss was in the intake bay when the transport cracked its seals, because he had made it his business to be there. He told himself it was diligence. A surgeon who was going to be handed a line of 40 subjects ought to know the quality of the stock coming off the corridor, ought to see them before the processing crews logged them into gray shifts and gray cells and unit numbers. That was the reason he gave the intake supervisor, a heavy kesh named Durgan, whose green-scaled bulk filled the doorway of the bay, and who did not care what reason a surgeon gave as long as the surgeon stayed out of the way. The transport had come in with 11 in the hold. 9 were adults, wrung out and silent in the way of people who had already learned that noise cost more than it bought. Sable stock, all of them, small and wary and marked by the border crew's rough handling. Voss watched the processing line take them one at a time, scan, number, shift, sell, and he made himself watch, because he had spent a decade not watching this part, letting the merchandise arrive as figures on a manifest, and he was beginning to suspect that the not watching had been the whole of his crime. The 10th off the transport was a child. He was perhaps 10 years old by the human count Voss had learned to estimate, small even for Sable, thin at the wrist, with the same brown hair as Unit 9 Sable, and the same unhurried way of taking in a room that Voss had stopped being able to tell himself was ordinary. The processing crew scanned him. The scanner chimed the deathworlder chime, the one that had started as a warning and become, in this facility, a price tag. A crewman reached to fit the boy with a shift, and the boy did not resist, and the crewman shoved him along the line anyway. A casual, open-handed shove between the shoulders, the kind of shove a bored man gives a thing he has decided is cargo. The child stumbled, caught himself, looked back not at the crewman Voss noticed, past him, at the tall observation window of the intake bay where a small gray figure had come to stand. Unit 9 Sable was not supposed to be in the intake gallery. Subjects were not moved during a corridor processing. The schedules were built to keep them apart. But there she was, on the other side of the glass, one tier up, and Voss realized with a slow, cold turn of his stomach that no one had brought her. She had come. She had walked wherever she needed to walk, along whatever surface would carry her, through a station that had been built on the assumption that its cells held their contents, and she had arrived at a window to watch a child come off a transport, and not one alarm had sounded, and not one guard had seen. She looked at the boy looked at her. Neither of them made a sign that any of the crew would have read as a sign. But Voss, who had spent a decade learning to read the small movements a body made when it was about to be dropped, saw the boy's shoulders come down half a degree, saw the fear go out of him and something steadier come in, and he understood that whatever passed between the two of them in that half-second was the child being told, across a sealed room and a sheet of glass, that he was not alone and would not be left. Then the woman turned from the window and was gone, and the intake supervisor's console, 3 minutes later, logged a subject as present in her cell, and no one but Voss ever knew she had left it. "You're pale," Alan said that evening over the calibration logs, "for a Sethiri, which takes doing." "I'm tired." "You're not tired. You've been tired for a decade and it never made you pale." The young assistant set down his stylus. His secondary lids were doing the thing they did when he'd worked up to a question he was afraid of. "Adept, what happens to her after the line is built?" "The overseer wants to study the mechanism." "Study it how?" Voss did not answer, because the answer was a surgical plan he had been asked, obliquely, to begin drafting, and because saying it aloud would make it a thing that existed in the room with them. Alan read the silence correctly. He was young, but he was not stupid. That had been the trouble with him from the start. "You built her," he said. "You gave her the finest integration this facility has ever produced, and now the reward for being extraordinary is that they take her apart to find out why." He was quiet a moment. "That's obscene." "It's the contract." "It's obscene and it's the contract. Both can be true." Alan looked at the log, at the line where the needle had pinned itself on the first day and never come down. You could file the mechanism as proprietary to the subject, non-reproducible. You could tell Calorum, the thing that makes her work dies with her frame, that you'd get 40 corpses and no line. He'd have to sell her to the Farron factor as a single unit and let her live. because a living product that works is worth more than a dead one you can't copy. He'd have the file audited. He'd find the truth in it. Then bury the truth deeper than the audit goes. Alan's 4 hands were flat on the table now, steady. You're the best liar with an instrument I've ever met, adept. You lie to subjects every day about how much a phase is going to hurt. Lie to him. Voss looked at his assistant for a long moment and felt the shape of the decision he had not yet made sitting in the room like a fifth presence, and did not pick it up. Go home, Alan, he said. Say nothing to anyone, nothing at all. Do you understand me? I understand you. The young Sethiri rose and paused at the door and said the thing that Voss would remember later, in the middle of everything, as the first honest sentence anyone had said in that facility in 10 years. She's going to leave, adept. You know that? A thing that can walk where no one's looking doesn't stay in a box because the box is locked. She's just waiting for a reason she can live with, and you keep giving her reasons. He left. Mara had a reason. She had had a reason since the frame chamber, since the factor's boneless finger had tapped the glass over her shape and said 40 of it, since she had understood that leaving alone would only buy the ones behind her a worse arithmetic. She was not counting doors anymore for herself. One person who could walk the walls could be out of the loom in a night, out into the transit rings and lost in a spaceport crowd and gone. She had known that for 11 days. She had stayed because there was a child now, and because there were 9 adults in gray shifts who did not know yet that the walls would hold them, and because a woman who left them to be a line of 40 corpses so that she could be free was not a woman Mara intended to become. So she counted differently now. She counted the maintenance zones where the gravity ran light, the long spinal conduits between the galleries where the loom's builders had trusted the structure and not the floor, where a Kesh guard's boots were useless, and a Sethiri's delicate inner sense would have him clutching a rail. She counted the vent lattice above the cell block, wide enough for a small body, unmonitored because nothing that mattered was supposed to be able to travel it. She counted the mag rails on the undersides of the galleries, the ones the cargo drones ran, and learned their schedules, and learned that a person who could hang from the underside of a moving world could ride a cargo rail from the cell block to the intake bay and back, and be logged as present in her cell the whole time. She counted the guards' rounds and found the seams in them, not the places where the guards were absent, but the places where they were present in the wrong dimension, watching a corridor at eye level while a person moved along the ceiling 9 feet above their upturned faces, and they never once looked up, because looking up was not a thing their bodies had ever needed to learn. And she counted the surgeon. She had not decided about the surgeon. He came to the cell block more than his duties required. He watched her in the frame with an attention that was not the overseer's attention. The overseer looked at her and saw a figure that had not yet been reconciled, and the surgeon looked at her and saw, she thought, a mistake he had made and did not know how to stop making. Twice he had countermanded a calibration order that would have pushed her past what was safe, and had written the countermand in a way that made it look like caution and not mercy. Once, when a Kesh guard had gripped her arm hard enough to bruise while moving her to a test, the surgeon had said 3 flat words to the guard in the conquered tongue, and the guard had let go and had not gripped her since. She did not trust him. Trust was a currency she spent carefully, and he had not earned enough of it. But she had revised him in the ledger from an obstacle to an unknown, and unknowns were worth watching, because sometimes an unknown was a door. On the 14th night she tested the door. Voss was alone in the calibration suite past the 3rd shift change, drafting the surgical plan he had been ordered to draft and had gotten no further into than a title, when the human spoke to him for the first time. She spoke from above him. He had not heard her come in. There was no way she could have come in. The suite sealed at 2nd shift and logged every entry, and no entry had logged. But when he looked up from the blank plan, she was there, folded into the join of the wall and the ceiling in the far corner of the room, braced across the angle with the ease of a thing that belonged there, looking down at him with her level, ordinary eyes. "You keep the good light on the instruments," she said. Her concord was rough, corridor-learned, but clean. "Not on the door. Whoever built your security thought about the door. Nobody thought about the corner." Voss did not stand. He was aware that standing would be a mistake, that fast movement of any kind would be a mistake, that he was a floor-bound thing being addressed by something that had reassigned the whole geometry of the room to its own purposes, and was being, at the moment, very calm about it. He set down his stylus. "You shouldn't be able to be there," he said. "I know you built me able." She said it without heat, a fact laid on a table. "That wasn't the plan, was it? The Farron wants a thing that clips to a rail. You made a thing that doesn't need the rail. You made a thing that doesn't need the floor." She tilted her head. "Does the overseer know yet that he can't sell what he built? That the only way to copy me is to take me apart, and taking me apart gets him a corpse and a mystery?" "He suspects." Voss heard his own voice come out level and was distantly grateful to a decade of practice for it. "He's asked me to draft a study." "A study?" She turned the word over. "That's the polite one. In the corridor they had a less polite one." She was quiet a moment, braced in the corner, watching him. "You could lie to him. Your assistant told you to. I heard him." "You hear a great deal." "Sound goes up," she said. "Nobody thinks about that either." She shifted her weight, and the shift ran through her whole body like water finding its level, and she was suddenly lower, braced now across the upper wall a body length above his desk, close enough that he could see the faint scar at her hairline, and the dirt the processing crews never quite got off deathworlder skin, and the complete, unhurried steadiness of her, which was the most alien thing in the room, and she was the only human in it. "I'm going to ask you one question, surgeon, and how you answer it decides what you are to me. Do you understand?" "Yes." "The child that came off the transport 2 days ago. The one you watched them shove." Her voice did not change. That was the thing Voss would remember. It stayed exactly as level asking this as it had been discussing the geometry of his security. "When the line is built and they've studied me to death and they still can't copy it, because they won't be able to, you know that, it doesn't live in the parts, it lives in where I was born. What happens to a sable child who takes the lattice as well as I did?" Voss was silent. "That's not the question," she said. "That's me telling you I already know the answer. Here's the question." She leaned a fraction closer, upside down above him, and the light he kept on the instruments caught her ordinary calm face and made it, for 1 second, the only clear thing in the room. "When it starts, and it's going to start, tonight or a night close to it, are you a door, or are you a wall? Because I can go through a wall. It just costs the wall more." And Surgeon Adept Ale Voss, who had spent a decade turning deathworlders into merchandise and calling it restorative work, who had built the finest integration his facility had ever produced and been ordered to draft its dissection, looked up at the small, calm, impossible thing he had made braced across the ceiling of his own suite, and found that the decision he had refused to pick up for 14 days was already in his hands, and had been for some time, and only needed to be spoken. "A door," he said. She studied him. Then she nodded once, filing it, and flowed back up into the corner and the joint of the wall, and was gone through a service gap he would have sworn was too small, and the suite logged no exit, and Voss sat alone with a blank surgical plan and the first clean feeling he'd had in 10 years, which was the feeling of having finally, at great and certain cost, chosen the more expensive thing. On the 15th, the overseer came to watch a demonstration, and Voss learned exactly how far the Concord would push a thing it had decided it owned. Calorum wanted a stress run, not for the Farron factor, who had already signed, but for a second buyer, a mining concern from the Autral reaches whose factor watched from a booth with the flat greed of a man pricing a tool. Calorum wanted the human run harder than Voss had ever run any subject. Null gravity, and then a rolling instability in the frame structure, the ribs and handholds shifting on their mounts to simulate a failing hull, the kind of thing that killed real hull workers when a ship took a hit, and the surface they trusted stopped being trustworthy. "That's not a calibration," Voss said quietly at the console. "That's a survival test. If the frame rolls while she's committed to a surface and the surface moves, she has nothing. No gravity to fall back on and no structure to trust. You'll lose her." "The mining factor wants to see it fail," Calorum said. "He wants to know where the product breaks. A tool you can't break is a tool you can't price. Run it." And here was the thing Voss did, that he did not tell the human about until much later, because there had been no time, and because a man does not advertise the one small mercy he can afford. He ran the stress test, because refusing would have gotten him removed from the console and replaced by someone who would run it worse. But he ran it with the frame's roll rate capped a fraction below the specification, and the shift amplitude trimmed, and the environmental margin held because the frame chamber, like every sealed volume on the loom, answered to environmental control, and environmental control answered to administration. And Calorum, standing at Voss's shoulder, had the environmental slate live in his own hand the whole time, ready to drop the chamber's pressure if the surgeon's caps let the human survive too easily. Voss noted that. He filed it the way she filed things. The air is his, even in here, even now. He controls the air from the slate in his hand. The human did not break. The frame went null, and then it began to roll, the ribs shifting under her, the handholds sliding on their mounts, and where any other subject would have committed to a surface and been thrown when the surface moved, the human did not commit. She rode the roll. She kept her weight distributed across 3 points and let no single one of them become a floor she trusted, so that when each in turn shifted and betrayed her, she had already assigned only a third of herself to it and simply flowed to the next, hand and foot in hand, across a structure that was actively trying to throw her, in a volume with no down to catch her if it did. She crossed the rolling frame corner to corner. She did it twice. And at the end she planted herself across the join of 2 ribs that were moving in opposite directions, braced between them, and held there, perfectly still, in a failing frame in null gravity, and turned her head and found the observation glass, and waited for the next instruction with the flat patience of a person who had found the whole thing neither difficult nor interesting. The mining factor stood up in his booth. Voss heard him, over the channel, say a number to his aide and then a larger number, and then stop pretending to price a tool. "She read the roll," Voss said, to no one, to himself, to the decade of subjects who had died in this chamber committing to a surface that moved. She never trusted a single surface long enough to be thrown by it. She treated the whole failing frame as the thing to balance against, and let each piece of it be temporary. He understood it as he said it, the way he had understood everything about her, a moment behind her and never once ahead. "We built her to know where down is. She decided down is a thing you rent, not a thing you own. You can't throw a person who never signed the lease." Calorum lowered the environmental slate he had not needed to use, and looked at the small, still figure braced in the failing frame, and said the thing that told Voss the timeline was going to move, though it would be another day before it did. "The mining concern wants 40 as well," the overseer said. "So does the Atril. So will the next one who sees this footage, and they'll all see it because I intend to sell the footage." His slate-gray eyes did not leave the human. "I don't need a labor line anymore, Adept. I need the procedure that makes the line. I need what's inside her mapped, reproducible on a slate I can sell 40 times over to 40 buyers. The subject was worth a contract. The mechanism is worth the catalog." He turned for the booth door. "Draft the study. I want to know what a sable inner sense is made of, and I want to know it before the footage finishes selling." He left and took the environmental slate with him, and Voss stood at the console a long moment with the human still braced and waiting in the frame, and understood that he had bought her exactly 1 day with a capped roll rate and a trimmed amplitude, and that the day was already spending itself, and that the decision he had refused to pick up was going to have to be picked up very soon, whether his hands were ready for it or not. He killed the frame's roll and brought the gravity back, and had her return to her cell, and did not look at the observation glass, because he knew that if he looked she would be looking back, level and ordinary and counting, and he was not yet ready to be counted. The overseer moved the timeline up on the 16th, and he did it the way he did everything, which was as a courtesy that was also a blade. He came to the calibration suite in person, which he rarely did, and he brought Durgan the intake supervisor with him, which he never did, and the presence of a green-scaled Kesh with a shock baton in a room full of instruments told Voss more than the overseer's flat, pleasant voice was going to. "The factors superiors have accelerated," Calorum said. "The Farron board wants the mechanism proven proprietary before they commit the full order. They've heard somehow that the line can't be built off a rail, that it's the subject herself and not the augmentation." His slate eyes rested on Voss without weight, which was how the Vril looked at you when they had already decided something and were watching to see if you'd make it difficult. "I wonder how they heard that, Adept. It was in your unfiled notes. And in a conversation your assistant apparently had with a colleague in the commissary, which a monitor apparently logged, because I have monitors on my commissary because I am not a sentimental man." Voss said nothing. Alan, he thought, not betrayal, worse, carelessness. The young are careless because they have not yet been made afraid, and he had made the boy afraid too late. "Where is Alan?" Voss asked. "Reassigned, corridor duty. It's a hard posting, but he'll survive it, probably." Calorum let that sit. "I've moved the study forward. We begin the exploratory tomorrow. We open the subject, we map the mechanism, we learn what a sable inner sense is made of, and we build the Farron their line off the map instead of off the subject. She won't survive the mapping. You and I both know the mechanism is distributed, that finding it means going everywhere, but she'll have given the conquered the most valuable single procedure in the catalog, and that is a fine thing for a piece of merchandise to be able to say it did." He smiled the horizontal Vril smile. "You'll run it. You built her. It's fitting that you close her. Durgan will bring her to the theater at first light." "The mapping won't work," Voss said. "I've told you, the mechanism isn't in the parts, it's in the death world. Yes, you've said, it's very poetic." Calorum's voice did not change, and that was the frightening thing about the Vril, that cruelty in them wore the exact tone as bookkeeping. "But the Farron board wants a body opened and a map drawn, and if the map is incomplete, we'll draw another off the child and another off the next transport, until the corridor gives us enough sable inner ears to average the thing into a procedure. I have authorized the acquisitions. I have authorized the theater. What I have not authorized, Adept, is one more word from you about poetry." He turned for the door. "First light, have your hands steady." He left and took the smell of the Kesh guard's baton oil with him, and Voss stood alone in the suite for exactly as long as it took to be sure the corridor monitor had cycled past, and then he looked up at the far corner, at the join of the wall and the ceiling, and spoke to it, though it was empty. "First light," he said to the corner. "They come for you at first light, and they'll draw the map off the child when yours comes up short." The corner did not answer. But that night, the vent lattice above the cell block carried a small weight it had never been built to carry, from one gray door to the next, and behind each door a sable adult who had spent 2 weeks believing the walls were a law learned, in a whisper through a service gap, that the walls were a decision, and that the decision was about to be made for all of them at once. Mara went to the child last, because he was the one who mattered most, and she wanted the others already moving before she spent time she didn't have on the one thing she could not do coldly. His cell was at the end of the block, a light-sealed door, the kind maintenance used, which was a carelessness on the conquered's part, and she was grateful for the carelessness. She came down the vent lattice and put her eye to the service gap and found him awake, sitting on the floor with his back to the bunk and his knees drawn up, and he was not crying. which she had been afraid of, and he was not asleep, which she had been more afraid of, because a child who could sleep in this place had given up something she would have had to spend the night giving back. "Hey," she said through the gap. Her concord fell away. This was in the corridor tongue, the flat-clipped sable dialect that the processing crews couldn't parse and wouldn't have cared to. "You awake in there?" His head came up. "Who's that?" "Somebody who came off a transport like yours a couple weeks back." She kept her voice low and level, the voice you used on a spooked animal or a frightened man, the voice that promised nothing it couldn't deliver. "What's your name?" A pause. Names were expensive in the corridor. Then carefully, "Tomas." "Tomas, I'm Mara." She set her palm flat against the door from the outside and heard, after a moment, the small sound of his palm finding the same place from within. "Listen to me, Tomas, and don't make noise and don't ask why yet. They did something to me, to the inside of my head behind my ears. You know how you always know which way is down?" "Yeah." "They took that away and gave me a better one. And I found out the better one lets me go places nobody watches, up walls, along ceilings, through the space over the guards' heads that they never learned to look at." She heard him shift. "They're going to do the same thing to you, Tomas, because you took the transport scan the way I did the chime. You heard the chime, and that means your head works like mine. But they're not going to do it to give you anything. They're going to open me up in the morning to draw a map, and when the map comes out wrong, they're going to open you up to draw another one. Do you understand what I'm telling you?" The silence on the other side of the door was the silence of a 10-year-old doing arithmetic no 10-year-old should have to do. Then, small and steady, in a voice that was already a sable adult's voice trapped in a child who hadn't grown into it yet. "You're telling me we leave first?" "We leave first," Mara said. "Tonight, all of us. The 9 off your transport and the ones from before and you. I've spent 2 weeks learning this place from the angle they don't guard. I know the way out. But I can't carry all of you up the walls, so here's the hard part, Tomas, and I need you to be the age you actually are and not the age you look." She pressed her palm harder to the door. "You have to be brave on the floor while I work the ceiling. You have to walk where I tell you, when I tell you, and trust that the reason nothing's coming for you is that I'm 9 feet up dealing with the thing that would have. Can you do that?" Another pause, shorter. "My sister used to say I was the bravest one in the shelter," Tomas said. "She's not on the transport, they didn't get her, so I have to still be the bravest one because if I get out I can tell somebody where she is." His palm pressed back against Mara's through the door. "I can do the floor, you do the ceiling." Something moved in Mara's chest that she did not have time for and set down carefully to pick up later if there was a later. "Good," she said. "That's good, Tomas. Now sit tight and wait for the light to change. When it goes amber, that's the surgeon. He's a door tonight, not a wall. When the door opens, you come." "The surgeon, doubt sharp and correct. They cut you." "Why's he a door?" "Because he built me too well and it broke something in him that I didn't think they had," Mara said. "Same as it's going to break in you if you're not careful. Getting good at a thing they meant as a cage." She drew back from the gap. "Amber light, Tomas. Wait for amber." Voss changed the light at the 4th shift change. When the block ran on skeleton watch, and a single Kesh guard sat at the monitor station reading a slate and trusting the seals to do his work for him. He did it from the calibration suite, through a maintenance authorization that was his to give and would not flag until an auditor went looking, which an auditor would, but not before first light, and first light was the whole of the margin he had. He set the cell block hold lights from red to amber, a maintenance state, a we are servicing these seals state, a state that unlocked the light maintenance doors and left the heavy magnetic ones sealed, which was exactly the set of doors that mattered, because the Concord in its economy had put the sable stock behind the cheap seals and saved the expensive ones for things it actually feared losing. The amber light came up in 11 cells at once, and in the vent lattice above the block, A small weight that had spent 2 weeks learning the difference between a wall and a decision began, at last, to move with purpose. And below it, one gray maintenance door after another sighed open on its cheap seal, and out into the amber-lit corridor came the sable stock of 2 transports, 9 adults blinking at a freedom they had stopped believing in, and one 10-year-old boy who stepped out of his cell and looked, first thing, not down the corridor at the way out, but up at the dark seam of the vent lattice, where a woman he had spoken to through a door was bracing herself across the ceiling like a promise being kept. "Floor," Mara said down to him in the corridor tongue and pointed the way. "I've got the ceiling. Move them quiet and move them now." The single Kesh guard at the monitor station, 40 meters up the corridor, turned a page on his slate and did not look up, because the alarm had not sounded, because the seals said the cells were closed, because in a decade of guarding floor-bound merchandise on a station built for floor-bound species, he had never once had a reason to learn that the most dangerous thing in his corridor might be 9 feet above his head, moving in a direction his whole life had taught him did not need to be watched. He learned it 11 seconds later, when the amber light caught the moving line of gray shifts at the edge of his vision, and he came up out of his chair reaching for the baton and the alarm klaxon both, and something dropped on him from the ceiling, fast and silent and exactly weighted, and took the baton out of his hand and the breath out of his chest, and pinned him to his own console with a knee across his spine before his hand reached the klaxon. And a calm, ordinary voice spoke into the side of his head in rough, clean Concord. "Don't," Mara said. "You're not paid enough to, and I'm not angry at you. Stay down and you get up in the morning. Reach for that alarm and you don't, your choice. Make it fast." The Kesh, who had spent his life being the largest thing in every room and had just been removed from that career by something half his size that had come from the one direction he'd never guarded, made the fast choice and stayed down and lived. And the line of sable stock moved past the monitor station and down the corridor toward the spinal conduit, quiet, a 10-year-old at the front of them walking the floor like he'd been told, and a woman above them walking the ceiling like she'd been made to. And behind the whole of it in the amber light, Surgeon Adept Ale Voss watched the corridor monitor feed from his suite and saw his merchandise walk out of its box, and did not sound the alarm, and began, with steady hands, to do the second thing he had decided to do that night, which was considerably more expensive than the first. The spinal conduit ran the length of the loom's dorsal gallery, and it was the single best thing the Concord's builders had ever done for a person trying to leave. It was a maintenance spine, a long structural corridor where the artificial gravity ran at 1/3 of full, because the crews who serviced the station's arteries needed to move mass and themselves through it without fighting a floor. For a Kesh, it was miserable footing. For a Sethiri, it was a slow, careful crawl along a rail with the delicate inner sense complaining the whole way. For 9 sable adults, it was a strange and buoyant lightness that made them clumsy and slow. For Mara, it was the closest thing to home she had felt since the corridor, because 1/3 of a gravity was a gravity a body could argue with, and she had been made to win that argument. "Keep to the rail," she called down low in Concord for the ones who only had conquered, hand over hand. "It's light in here, it'll try to float you off the deck. Don't fight it, ride it. Tomas, count them through the choke." The choke was a pressure junction 2/3 down the spine where the conduit narrowed, and a bulkhead iris cycled on a slow maintenance rhythm, open 40 seconds, sealed 20. Mara had timed it from the vent lattice over 3 nights. She had not timed it with 11 people, one of them a child, all of them light-footed and frightened, and she watched from the ceiling of the conduit as the first pass sent 7 through and left 4 stranded on the wrong side when the iris began to close. She dropped. She came down the inside of the closing iris head first, reassigned her whole sense of down to the moving bulkhead in the half-second she had, jammed the toe of one boot into the iris track and the flat of one hand against the leading edge, and she held the closing door, not with strength. She had no illusions about strength, but with leverage and balance and a body that could brace across a moving surface as though the surface were solid ground. The iris shuddered against her weight. Its motor was built to crush a jam, not to be jammed by something that could feel exactly where the mechanism was weakest and put its whole reassigned weight there. "Through," she said through her teeth. "Now. Go." The last 4 went through under her braced arm, Tomas shoving the slowest of them ahead of him with both small hands, and when the last shift cleared the gap, Mara let the iris take back its track and rode the closing edge up and out, spilling off the top of it into the low gravity, tumbling once and catching a rib and stopping, and the iris sealed on empty air behind her. On the far side, 11 Sable stood in the light gravity and looked up at her, and she read the thing on their faces that she had been dreading, the thing that was more dangerous to this night than any guard, which was hope. Hope made people slow. Hope made them believe the hard part was over. "Not out yet," she said before it could set. "That was the easy door. Move." Calorum learned of it at first light, which was later than he should have, and exactly as late as Voss had bought him. The exploratory theater was prepped and empty. The subject was not in her cell. The seal log said present, the physical check said gone, and the discrepancy between those two facts was the single most expensive line of data the Meridian Concord had generated in a decade. By the time Durgan's guards had swept the cell block and found 11 cheap seals cycled to amber and 11 cells empty, the line of Sable stock was 3 galleries away and climbing. "Lock the transit rings," Calorum said. He had not raised his voice. He stood at the tall administration window with the bright turning galleries below him and the daylit planet beyond, and he watched the station's schematic bloom with the red of a facility sealing itself. Every ring, every dock, every corridor to the outer wheel. Nothing leaves the loom. Put guards on the floor of every gallery between the cell block and the transit rings and tell them to look up. A pause. Tell them specifically to look up. They won't think to. Their species never do. That's how she's moving. She's using the overhead, the structure, the light grav spine. She goes where a floor-bound body can't follow. He turned from the window. "Where is Adept Voss?" Not answering his sweet overseer. "No," Calorum said. "I don't imagine he is." And he did a thing then that Voss had not entirely predicted, which was that he did not waste a moment on rage or on the surgeon's betrayal or on the ledger of it. He simply reconciled the figure. Voss was a door. Doors could be closed later. The merchandise was walking, and the merchandise was the number that mattered. "Get me the Farron factor on a secure line," he said. He's still in system. Tell him his line is proving itself right now, live, against my entire security apparatus, and that he should decide quickly whether he wants 40 of what's currently making fools of my guards, or whether he wants to renegotiate downward for having watched it happen. And get me the outer wheel dock logs. If she's smart, and she is smart, she's the smartest thing we've ever built. She's not running for the nearest ring. She's running for the one we're not watching. The one they were not watching was the freight dock on the ventral wheel, and the reason they were not watching it was that Voss had spent the hour before first light making it look. On every schematic Calorum would pull, like a dock already swept and sealed and empty. He did it from a maintenance terminal 2 galleries from his suite, because his suite was the first place they'd look, and he had no intention of being found before he'd finished. He was not a systems man. He was a surgeon, and the analogy that got him through the false work was surgical. He was not breaking the station's security. He was closing off a bleeder, isolating a section, making the body believe a part of itself was already handled so that the thing he was protecting could move through it unseen. He rerouted the ventral freight dock's status to read swept and sealed. He held open a single cargo drone rail that ran from the base of the spinal conduit down to that dock, a rail that traveled the underside of 3 galleries, a rail no walking thing could use. A rail a thing that could hang from the underside of a moving world could use very well. Then he sent one message on a channel he knew was monitored to a corridor duty posting 3 galleries out because he owed the young Sethiri that much and more. The message said only, The commissary you spoke in has monitors. Go to ground. Do not use your certifications. It was not an apology. There was no time to build one. But Alan would read it and understand that his adept had known he was compromised and had chosen, at the end, to spend a warning on him instead of a blame. And that would have to be the apology, because it was all the knight had left to give. Voss shut the terminal. He looked for a moment at his 4 hands, which were steady, which had been steady his whole career doing the work he was now spending that career to undo. Then he went to find the human, because there was one door left on her way out that he could not open from a terminal, and it was the last one, and it was the reason he had made himself indispensable to the knight instead of merely absent from it. The cargo rail carried them down. Mara had them clipped to the drone hardpoints 2 at a time. The adults first, in pairs, riding the flat cargo pallets down the underside of the galleries, with the daylit planet wheeling past below them through the transparent stress panels. 300 meters of open drop under their feet, and nothing between them and it but a rail and a stranger's word that the rail would hold. Some of them wept on the way down. One, a broad sable man with a scar through his lip, held the child's hand the whole descent and told him a story in the corridor tongue about a river. And Tomas, who was the last down with Mara because she would not send him without her, listened to the story of the river with his eyes on the wheeling planet and did not once look at the drop. Almost, Mara told him above the rail hum. She was not clipped to anything. She rode the underside of the pallet the way she rode everything, braced and easy, her sense of down reassigned to the moving rail, and she kept one hand loosely on the boy's harness the whole way, not because he needed holding but because he needed to know a hand was there. Almost, Tomas. You did the floor. You did it right. One more door. The surgeon door. The surgeon door, she agreed. He's meeting us at the bottom. If he's what I filed him as, the dock's open and there's a hull crawler fueled and he's already gone by the time we land, because a smart door doesn't wait around to be seen holding itself open. She watched the ventral dock rise toward them, bright through the stress panels, marked on every schematic she'd stolen as swept and sealed and therefore empty and therefore theirs. And if he's a wall. You go through the wall, Tomas said. It just costs the wall more. You've been listening. You talk a lot for somebody who's cold all the time. Mara almost smiled. She filed the almost to spend later if there was a later. Brace, she said. We're down. The pallet met the dock. 11 sables stood on the deck of a freight dock that the whole of the Meridian Conquered believed was empty, under the bright wheeling planet, and at the far end of it, the outer airlock stood open on a fueled hull crawler exactly as a smart door would have left it. And standing beside the open lock, not gone, not already away, was Surgeon Adept Ale Voss, who had not been smart about the last part, who had waited around to be seen holding the door. Because the last lock needed a living authorization, and there had been no way to fake it and no one else to give it. He had 4 hands raised, empty, palms out, the universal shape a body made to say, I am not the thing you have to go through. The crawler's fueled, he said in Concord quickly, to the woman walking toward him across the dock. The lock authorizes to my hand and only my hand, I couldn't root around it. It's a surgeon tier seal. They built the medical evac to trust a surgeon and I am one. You'll clear the outer wheel and be in open transit before Calorum finishes sweeping the rings. The crawler's beacon is Concord registered. Ditch it at the first neutral port and go dark. He lowered his hands a fraction. I've done what a door can do. Take them and go. Mara stopped in front of him. She looked at him with the level, ordinary eyes he had first seen through observation glass in a dark chamber, and she looked at the open lock, and the fueled crawler, and the 11 behind her already moving toward it, and she looked back at him, and she did the arithmetic he could see her doing, the arithmetic that had kept her in a box for 2 weeks when she could have left in a night. You waited, she said. You didn't have to be here. You could have opened it and gone. Why are you standing where I can see you? Because the seal needs my hand on it while you board, Voss said. It closes if I let go, and because, he stopped. A decade of giving nothing away made the next words the hardest surgery of his life. Because I built you into a cage and called it a gift, and there was no honest way to open the door except to stand in it. If I'd run, I'd have been a coward who helped. I found I'd rather be a door. Behind him, far up the spine of the station, an alarm finally found the empty freight dock that all the schematics had sworn was sealed, and began, at last, to scream. The alarm changed the dock in the way an alarm changes everything, which is to say it took a place that had been a secret and made it a destination. Mara did not waste the second she had on the surgeon's confession. She filed it a door, standing in the door, wounded already by the standing, and turned to the crawler and the 11, and did the only math the alarm allowed. Board, she said, flat carrying. Adults first, fill it back to front, strap where you can and hold on where you can't. Tomas, you're last with me. Move. They moved. 2 weeks of learning that the walls were a law had left them slow to believe a door could be a door. But the alarm was a language every Sable knew in the body, and they went up the crawler's ramp in a fast, quiet line while Voss stood at the boarding seal with one hand flat on the medical panel, holding the outer lock in its cycle, and the first of Durgan's guards came onto the dock floor at the far end. There were 6 of them, Kesh, green-scaled and heavy, and they came in the low, fast wedge of a species built to close ground, and they had been told to look up. And they did look up. Mara saw them do it, saw the wedge falter as a dozen eyes swept the overhead trusses and found nothing, because there was nothing yet to find. Looking up was not the same as knowing what to do about what you saw. The Kesh had been given the fact of her, and none of the grammar of her, and the gap between the two was the only weapon Mara had ever needed. Voss, she said without turning, the outer doors, do they open from here? Local override in the control spar. His voice was tight. Holding the seal cost him something she could hear. But Calorum will have locked the outer bay from administration the moment the alarm found us. The spar override can force it. Local authority beats remote. But the spar is up. Mara was already reading it. A control spar 30 meters up the dock's inner wall, a maintenance nacelle on a gantry, reachable by a service ladder that 6 Kesh could hold at the bottom until the sun went out. Good, keep your hand on that seal. Whatever you see, keep it there. She looked back once at the crawler ramp. 9 aboard, 2 to go. Tomas at the bottom, watching her, waiting for the word. Floor, she told him. Get the last 2 up. Don't look at me, look at the ramp. And then she went up the wall, and the grammar of her arrived on the dock all at once. The Kesh wedge broke for the crawler, and Mara took the overhead away from them. She went up the inner wall in 4 moves, hand and foot, her weight reassigning to the vertical the way water finds a new level, and she was across the underside of the truss run before the lead guard had covered half the dock floor. She did not go at the guards. That was the thing Voss watched from the seal and would try later to explain to people who had not seen it and would not believe him. She never once went at them. She went where they had to not be. She dropped from the truss onto the service ladder above the climbing point and kicked the release that dropped its lower third clattering to the deck. And the wedge that had reached the ladder found 40 meters of smooth spar wall between themselves and the woman now standing on the underside of the gantry, calm, looking down at them upside down, and no way up that a floor-bound body could take. Up top, a guard bellowed, pointing. She's on the spar, get the launchers. No launchers, came Calorum's voice, flat and immediate, over every guard's earcom and over the dock's general channel, so that Mara heard it too, which was the overseer's intention. You will not fire ordnance in a freight dock with a fueled crawler and a surgeon-tier seal cycling. You will not damage the merchandise. You will hold the floor and you will hold the surgeon and you will wait for me. She has nowhere to go. The outer bay is locked from administration and it stays locked. A pause precisely waited. Adept Voss, take your hand off that seal. Voss did not take his hand off the seal. Adept. The overseer's voice did not rise. It never rose. It simply grew colder, which in a whirl was the same as a hand closing. You have perhaps 90 seconds before I arrive on that dock in person. In those 90 seconds you can become a man who made an error under a subject's influence, which is a survivable thing, or you can become the thing whose hand was on the seal when the merchandise walked. Take your hand off. High on the underside of the gantry, Mara found the local override panel and put her hand on it, and it lit red under her palm, remote locked, exactly as Voss had said. Administration holding the outer doors shut from 3 galleries up. Local authority beats remote. That was the rule Voss had given her. But the panel wanted an authorization it was not going to take from a subject's hand. And for one cold second Mara looked at the red panel and understood that the surgeon's rule had a floor she was standing under. Local beat remote, but local still had to be someone the panel trusted. Voss, she called down level, across the whole dock, in front of the guards and the overseer's open channel, because there was no time for anything but the truth. The spar override wants a surgeon tier hand, same as your seal. Does it take yours? Silence on the channel. On the dock floor, 30 meters below her, Surgeon Adept Ale Voss stood with one hand on the boarding seal, and the crawler's ramp still open, and 2 sables still to board, and 6 Kesh guards between him and any door. And he understood the shape of what she was asking, which was that he could not do both. The seal took his hand to keep the outer lock cycling and the ramp live. The spar override, 30 meters up a wall he could not climb, took the same hand to force the outer bay doors. 1 surgeon, 2 seals, and a channel open to the overseer who was listening and who now understood it too. Yes, Voss said to Mara on the open channel, giving it away because the giving away was the only move left. It takes mine, but it's up there and I'm down here and I cannot be in 2 places. And if I leave this seal, the ramp closes with your people half aboard. Then don't leave it, Mara said. Send your hand up without your feet. And she reached down from the gantry, along the spar wall, to the maintenance conduit that ran beside the override panel. A service line, a data and authorization trunk, the kind of line a station ran everywhere it ran a seal, and she found, where the trunk met the panel, the junction Voss's whole false work had been quietly built toward without either of them planning it, and she keyed her calm and said one flat sentence to the surgeon holding the door below her. Route your authorization up the trunk, she said. You keep your hand on the seal, you send your credential to the panel. I'll put your hand on the override for you. It should not have worked, and the reason it worked was that Voss was a surgeon and not a systems man. And a surgeon thinks in terms of a signal traveling a nerve to a distant part of a body, and doing its work there without the surgeon having to hold the distant part in his hand. He routed his surgeon tier credential up the authorization trunk from the boarding seal, a thing the medical evac system was built to allow because a surgeon in an emergency might need to authorize a distant lock without abandoning a patient. And the credential traveled the line. And 30 meters up the wall the local override panel read a surgeon tier hand on its authorization channel and turned from red to amber under Mara's palm, and Mara pressed it. And the outer bay doors of the ventral freight dock began, against Caloram's remote lock, against 3 galleries of administrative authority, to grind open on the bright wheeling face of the daylit planet. Local beat remote, it always had. The Concord had built it that way on purpose, so that a surgeon on a dock could always get a wounded body out even if administration was compromised. And it had never once occurred to the men who built that rule that the compromise might come from a surgeon and a subject working the same seal from opposite ends of a wall. Close them, Caloram said on the channel, and for the first time in Voss's decade of service, there was something in the overseer's flat voice that was not bookkeeping. Administration, force the outer bay closed, override the surgeon tier. Can't override local overseer, a clerk's voice came back, thin and afraid. Local authorities holding them. It's a surgeon tier lock, we can't beat it from here, that's the whole point of the... I know what the point of it is. The channel cut. Below Mara, the outer doors ground open on open space in the daylit planet, and the crawler's ramp sealed on the last of the 11, 9 aboard, then 10, the broad scarred sable man hauling the slowest woman up the ramp by both arms, and only Tomas was left at the bottom, one small hand on the ramp rail, his face turned up, waiting for the word that had gotten him this far, the word that told him it was his turn. "Tomas," Mara called down, "aboard now, you did the floor. Go." And Tomas, who was 10 years old and brave, and the reason a woman who could have left in a night had stayed for 2 weeks, put one foot on the ramp and looked up at the woman on the underside of the gantry, and did not go, because at the far end of the dock, moving out of the corridor and onto the deck in a slow vertical line the color of wet slate, Overseer Neth Calorum had arrived in person, and he had not come to hold the floor. He had come to change the arithmetic. Calorum did not hurry. That was the virile in him, and it was also the strategy. A man who hurries has admitted the outcome is in doubt, and the overseer intended to admit nothing. He walked out onto the dock floor with 2 aides and a control slate in one long slate-gray hand, and he stopped at the midpoint of the deck, in the clear bright light coming through the open outer bay, equidistant from the crawler ramp where a child stood with 1 foot raised, and the boarding seal where a surgeon stood with 1 hand pinned, and the gantry 30 meters up where a small woman hung upside down against the spar wall with an override under her palm. He looked at none of them first. He looked at the slate. Then he raised his eyes and he addressed the woman on the ceiling, because he had understood, somewhere in the last hour, that she was the only figure on the dock that mattered and the rest were entries. "You've done something remarkable," Calorum said. His voice carried without effort in the bright, still air. "I want you to know that I mean that. In a decade I have never lost a subject off this facility. You didn't merely leave. You turned my own architecture against me, my seals, my surgeon, my rule that local beats remote. That rule exists because I insisted on it, years ago, over the objections of men who said a surgeon should never be able to override administration. I told them a body should always be able to reach a door." The horizontal smile. "I did not anticipate the body would be yours." Mara said nothing. She had learned in the corridor that a man who wants to be answered is a man who is buying time, and she had all the outer bay she needed already open behind the crawler, and only one thing left to do, which was get Tomas up the ramp, and the overseer was standing in the exact place on the deck that made that the hardest thing in the room. "I'm going to describe the situation," Calorum went on, unhurried, "because you are a person who deals in situations and not in feelings, and I respect that, and I intend to speak to you in your own currency. The outer bay is open. Your people are aboard the crawler, 10 of them. The crawler will launch the moment its ramp seals. You have arranged all of this beautifully, and it is, functionally, complete. Except," he turned the slate face out, so the woman on the gantry could see the display on it, though she could not read the Concord script. She did not need to. "This is dock environmental control, local to this bay. It authorizes to administration tier to me, and it does not care about surgeon tier overrides, because it was built by the same men who lost the argument about local doors, and they made very sure that the man who could not lock a door could at least always control the air." He let that land. "I can vent this dock, right now. Everything not sealed inside the crawler goes out the open bay into open space, the surgeon at the seal, the child at the ramp. And the 10 aboard the crawler, if I choose to hold its launch clamps, which I also control from here, long enough for the vent to take it before it clears." On the dock floor, the surgeon at the seal went very still. At the ramp, Tomas lowered his raised foot to the deck slowly and did not run for the crawler, because running for the crawler meant the clamps, and the child had already understood the clamps the way he understood everything, a beat ahead of where a child should be. "So here is the arithmetic," Calorum said. "In your currency, cleanly, you come down from the spar. You put yourself back in my hand. You do it in the next 30 seconds. And in exchange, I release the launch clamps and the crawler carries your 10 away and the surgeon lives and the child lives and only you return to the theater, which was always the only outcome the Farron board was paying for anyway. One subject opened mapped. 10 walk free and a child grows up, for the price of one deathworlder who was going to be opened regardless. The smile did not move. It's a good trade. Better than good. You save everyone but the one person you were never going to be able to save. And I know you see it, because you've been doing this arithmetic since the frame chamber. You stayed 2 weeks for exactly this math. Come down and pay it. It was, Voss would think later, the cruelest thing he had ever watched a man do with a voice, and it was cruel precisely because it was fair. Calorum had not lied. He had not bluffed. He had built a true trade and handed it to the one mind on the dock that could not pretend the trade was false, and he had done it in the flat, reasonable tone of a man reconciling a ledger. And the horror of it was that it would work, because it was correct, because a person who dealt in situations and not in feelings would take it, because 10 and a child for one was the trade any cold arithmetic would make. And the woman on the gantry did not take it. She did not rage. Voss watched her the whole time, and there was never a moment of rage, never a shout, never the animal recoil of a cornered thing. There was only the small level face he had first seen through observation glass, doing what it always did, which was counting. She looked at the overseer's slate. She looked at the open outer bay and the wheeling planet. She looked at the surgeon at the seal, and at the child at the ramp, and at the clean, bright geometry of the dock that Calorum had turned into a killing floor with a single true sentence. And then she spoke, for the first time since he'd arrived, in rough, clean Concord that carried as easily as his had. You control the air from that slate, she said. It was not a question. Local to this bay, administration tier. In your hand. In my hand, Calorum agreed. Then the whole of your position is that slate, Mara said. Not the guards. The guards can't come up here, they proved that. Not the launch clamps. Those release the second I make you release them. The air is the only thing you've got that reaches me, and the air lives in your hand, 30 meters down, in a room where the only thing you never learned to guard is the direction I'm already in. She shifted her weight on the gantry, and the shift ran through her the way it always did, water finding its level, and she was no longer upside down. She was crouched on the underside of the spar with her feet under her, and her whole reassigned sense of down pointed, now, at the slate-gray man on the bright deck below. You did the arithmetic in my currency. Let me finish it in yours. You have one move that ends this the way you want, and it's to vent the dock before I reach you. And you won't make it. Because the instant you touch that slate, I'm coming down the wall and I will reach your hand before the vent cycles, and you have never once in your life had to be fast in the direction of up. You can't cross 30 meters faster than a vent cycles, Calorum said, and for the first time his voice had a thing in it that was not bookkeeping, because he had run the numbers too and found the answer uncomfortably close to the edge of true. I don't have to cross 30 meters, Mara said. I have to cross to you. And you're standing directly under me, Overseer, because you walked to the middle of the deck to be equidistant from the seal and the ramp and the spar, and equidistant from 3 things puts you exactly beneath the 4th. She was already moving as she said it, not fast, not yet, flowing down the spar wall head first with her weight reassigned to the vertical, unhurried, certain, a thing descending a surface that had never once been a floor to anyone but her. You gave me a true trade. Here's mine. Take your hand off that slate and step away from it, and you live, and your guild answers for what's in the records instead of getting to write them. Touch it, and you find out how fast the direction you never guarded actually is. You have about the time it takes me to reach you to decide. I'd decide. Calorum touched the slate. He was a Virl, and a Virl does not believe at the bottom of himself that a subject can beat a system he has built. The belief is not available to him, the way certain colors are not available to certain eyes. He had run the numbers and found them close, and closeness to Calorum was not a reason to fold. It was the exact margin in which men who deal in situations win, because the other party flinches at close and the Vril does not. So he touched the slate, and his long slate-gray thumb found the vent authorization, and he began to enter the sequence that would open the dock to space with a surgeon and a child still standing on it. He got 2 entries into a sequence of 5. What came down the spar wall was not fast in the way a falling thing is fast, which is to say helpless. It was fast in the way a decision is fast once it has stopped being deliberated. Mara came down 30 meters of vertical surface with her whole rebuilt sense of down committed to the wall, her feet and hands finding the ribs and handholds the Concorde's builders had set there for maintenance crews who would never in their lives have used them at speed. And she crossed the distance between the gantry and the deck in the time it took the overseer to reach the 3rd entry of 5, and she did not land on the floor. She landed on him. She took him the way she had taken the guard at the monitor station, exactly weighted, precisely placed, a body dropping onto a body from the one direction it had never been built to defend. And the slate went out of his hand and across the deck, and Calorum went down onto the bright floor of his own dock with a small woman's knee across the base of his spine, and her hand already flat over the slate where it had skidded to a stop, killing the vent sequence at 3 entries of 5. And the dock did not open, and the air stayed, and the child at the ramp let out a breath that Voss heard from 20 meters away. Mara did not hit him. That was the thing Voss watched, and it was the thing he would spend the rest of his life failing to make other people understand. She had the overseer pinned and the slate under her hand, and every reason in the recorded history of the corridor to make him pay, and she did not hit him, did not choke him, did not so much as raise her voice. She held him down with a knee and a wrist lock that cost her almost nothing to maintain, and she picked up the slate with her free hand and looked at it, and then she spoke to him in the flat level voice she had used for everything, close to the side of his head, in the bright still air. "You built a good trade," she said. "It was fair. I want you to know I heard how fair it was. And here's what I'm doing with it." She thumbed the slate, not the vent. She left the vent alone. She found the launch clamps and released them, and 40 meters away the crawler's clamps let go with a heavy clunk that ran through the deck. "Your 10 walk. That part of your trade I'm keeping because it was the true part. The other part, the one where I go back to the theater, I'm declining, because you made a mistake in your arithmetic, overseer, the same mistake your whole guild made. You costed me as a subject who deals in situations and not in feelings, and you were right that I deal in situations." She leaned a fraction closer. "But you never once asked what the situation was. You thought the situation was 10 free for 1 opened. The situation was always that I don't leave anyone in the box, not them, not the child, and not the next transport either, which is why I'm not just leaving with them." She held up the slate where he could see it, and thumbed it again, and this time she did not open a lock or release a clamp. This time she opened the thing Voss had given her in the hour before first light, the thing the surgeon had spent his own indispensability to place in her reach. The Meridian Augmentation Concorde's acquisition records, the corridor manifests, the client contracts, the surgical study Calorum had ordered drafted, and Voss had left in the file with its true title on it. All of it queued to a station-wide and system-wide broadcast on a channel that administration-tier authority could open, and no lesser authority could stop. "You told your clerks local beats remote," Mara said. "You were proud of it. A body should always be able to reach a door." She pressed the broadcast. "This is a door." The records went out across the loom, and across the transit rings, and across the open channel to the Farron Factor's ship still holding in system, and to 11 other client factors whose contracts were in the file, and to the neutral port authorities 3 jumps out who had spent years unable to prove what everyone suspected about what the Meridian Concorde did with the stock it bought off the Sable Corridor. And the broadcast did in 19 seconds what no fleet and no armada and no cold act of violence could have done, which was to make the Concord's entire business a thing that could no longer be denied by the people whose deniability was the only thing keeping it alive. Voss felt the channel open under his hand at the seal, felt the surgical study he had refused to write, and then written wrong on purpose go out into the light with his own credential on it, unfillable now, unauditable, a confession he could never take back and had never wanted to more than he wanted to at that exact moment, and never once actually reached for. On the deck, Calorum lay still under a subject's knee and did not struggle, because struggling was a feeling, and the overseer did not deal in feelings, and he watched his guild broadcast itself into ruin on his own administration tier channel, and he said the only thing left in his ledger to say, in a voice that had finally, at the very end, run out of the flat, pleasant tone it had worn for a decade. "You've destroyed a great deal of value," he said. "I know," Mara said. "That was the situation." And she took her knee off his spine and stood and stepped back out of his reach and left him lying on the bright floor of his own dock with the slate on the deck between them and the vent sequence unfinished, and the air still holding and every guard on the floor frozen because their overseer was down, and their orders had run out, and the thing that had put him down was standing over him not even breathing hard. "Stay down," she told him, without heat. "You're not paid enough to get up, and I'm still not angry. None of you were ever the thing I was angry at. The thing I was angry at was the arithmetic. And I just changed it." Durgan, the intake supervisor, made the last mistake anyone made on the dock that day, and he made it for the oldest reason, which was that a large thing that has been made small in front of its own people will reach for anything that might make it large again. He broke for the child. He was closest to the ramp of any of the guards, green-scaled and heavy and fast over open ground, and he understood, in whatever the Kesh had instead of cunning, that the woman's whole position rested on the 10 aboard and the child at the ramp, and that a hand on the child was the one piece of leverage left on the board. So he broke from the frozen line and closed the ground to the ramp in 4 heavy strides, and reached the child, and got one green-scaled hand around Tomas's thin arm. He got exactly that far. Voss was the one who moved first, which surprised no one more than Voss. The surgeon left the seal, knowing the ramp would close, knowing it was the wrong trade, moving anyway because a decade of not moving had to end somewhere, and it might as well end at a child. And he got 2 steps before the Kesh's free arm caught him across the chest and put him down hard against the deck, and the seal behind him, unheld, began to close. But 2 steps was all the time the thing on the deck needed, because the thing on the deck did not have to cross the floor. Myra took the overhead. She was up the nearest spar and across the truss run, and above the ramp before Durgan had finished turning to see where the surgeon had come from, and she came down on the hand that held the child, not on the Kesh, on the hand, exactly weighted, all of her reassigned weight through the one joint that a grip depends on, and the hand opened, and Tomas was free, and Durgan bellowed and swung at the space where she had been and found her already gone from it, already on the underside of the ramp gantry, already reaching down with one hand to haul the child up and back and behind her. "Aboard," she said to Tomas, flat final. "Now no more floor, you're done with the floor. Go." And Tomas went, up the ramp, into the crawler, the last of the 11, and turned in the hatch to look back at the woman on the gantry and the surgeon on the deck and the overseer on the floor and the whole bright ruined dock. And the ramp began to seal, and Mara looked once at the surgeon lying where the Kesh had put him, 20 meters away, on the wrong side of a closing hatch, and did the last arithmetic of the day out loud, so he would hear it. So he would not think for 1 second that she had left him by accident. "Door," she said to him, across the dock in Concord over the closing ramp. "You were a door. Doors don't get left." And she came down off the gantry, across the deck, past the frozen guards and the fallen overseer, and she got a hand under the surgeon's arm and hauled him up off the floor with a strength her small frame had no business owning and did not own. It was leverage. It was balance. It was a body that knew exactly where his weight wanted to go and helped it go there. and she got him to the ramp as it sealed, and through it, and the hatch closed on the two of them last, and the crawler's clamps were already loose. And the outer bay was already open, and there was nothing left between the 11 Sable and the surgeon who had freed them and the bright wheeling planet but a launch sequence, and the last thing the Meridian Concord had left to throw. The crawler cleared the bay on manual, because Voss flew it on manual, because a surgeon-tier medical evac crawler answered to a surgeon's hand, and there was exactly one of those aboard, and he flew it lying half-propped against the pilot rest with 2 of his 4 hands, and a chest that a Kesh forearm had done something to that he did not have time to name. It was an ugly launch. The crawler was built to carry the injured off a station gently, not to run, and it lumbered out of the ventral bay into open space over the daylit planet with all the grace of a thing designed for a different afternoon. Behind it the loom turned bright and enormous, its white galleries wheeling, and out of 2 of those galleries, from the security berths on the outer wheel, 3 Concord cutters detached and came about and lit their drives and began, fast and clean and purpose-built, to close. "They're launching," said the broad-scarred sable man at the aft port in the flat voice of a person reporting whether he cannot change. 3, coming fast." "I see them," Voss said. His Concord came out wet at the edges. "The crawler won't outrun a cutter. It was never going to. That was never the plan." "What was the plan?" Mara said. She was at the forward port, one hand on the frame, watching the cutters grow, and she asked it the way she asked everything, flat, wanting data. "The plan was the broadcast," Voss said. "The plan was that by the time we launched, every cutter captain on that wheel would already know the records were public. The plan was to change what it costs them to catch us." He got the crawler's nose around toward the near jump lane and the daylit curve of the planet. "I couldn't give you a faster ship. I gave you a slower guild." Cutter Captain Reth Salyun of the Concord Security Wing had been given a clean order: intercept the medical crawler, clamp it, bring it back to the ventral dock, and he had been flying long enough to know a clean order given in a dirty hour when he heard one. He had the crawler on his board, slow and fat and unarmed, an easy clamp, the kind of intercept a cadet ran in a simulator. And he had on his other board the thing that had come across every channel on the wheel 19 minutes ago and had not stopped propagating since. The Meridian Concord's acquisition records, the corridor manifests, the client contracts, the surgical study with a surgeon's own credential on it, and a title on it that Salyun had read once and then wished he had not. He had a wife on the neutral port 3 jumps out. He had a certification that said Concord Security Wing on it, a certification that had been a proud thing to hold that morning, and had become, in 19 minutes, a thing he was going to have to explain for the rest of his life. "Captain," his second said, "Wing leads ordering the clamp. Says the Overseer's authority is still live." "The Overseer's authority," Salyun said, watching the slow fat crawler run for the lane, "is currently lying on the floor of his own freight dock, according to the same channel that just put my employer's client list in front of the entire port authority. Is that the authority we're clamping under?" "He's still Overseer. Orders an order. An order's an order until it's the last order you ever obey." Salyun did not slow, but he did not close either. He held his distance, and he watched the other 2 cutters on his board, and he saw, with a slow, cold recalibration that he would try, later, to describe to the Port Authority investigators and would never quite manage, that both of them were also holding their distance. 3 cutters, purpose-built, unopposed, an easy clamp on a fat, slow crawler, and not one of them was closing the last of the gap, because every captain on the wing was doing, alone at his own board, the exact arithmetic the woman on the dock had done out loud, that the records were public, and that the last officer to lay hands on the fleeing evidence after the records went public was the officer whose name the Port Authority would have, in ink, forever. "She didn't outrun us," Salyun said, mostly to himself, watching the crawler make the lane. "She didn't outgun us. She made it so the smart move for every one of us on our own was to let her go. He keyed the wing channel. Wing lead, this is Salyun, negative on the clamp. I'm not putting my name on that crawler with the whole port watching the reason why. You want it clamped, you fly down there and clamp it yourself, and you explain the manifest to the authority when they dock. A pause on the channel. Then, one after another, in the flat voices of men choosing the cheaper of two ruins, the other two cutters called the same. The crawler made the jump lane unclamped, and behind it 3 purpose-built cutters that could have taken it in a minute turned, one by one, back toward a station that was no longer a place any of them wanted their name attached to. And Captain Reth Salyun flew home to write the report that would end his career in the wing and begin, though he did not know it yet, the testimony that would end the Meridian conquered. Inside the crawler, no one cheered. Sable Stock did not cheer. Cheering was a thing you did when you believed the hard part was over, and these were people who had learned in the corridor that the hard part is never over, only traded for a different hard part. But the broad, scarred man let out a long breath, and the woman he'd carried down the rail put her face in her hands, and a child came forward through the cramped hole to the forward port and stood next to the small, calm woman who had spent 2 weeks learning a station from the angle no one guarded, and looked out at the jump lane and the receding bright wheel of the loom. "They're not following," Tomas said. "No. Because of what you sent out. The records. Because of what he gave me to send out." Mara nodded back toward the pilot rest, where Voss lay half-propped in gray, flying with 2 hands and holding his chest with a third. "He built the door. I just walked through it in front of everybody so they couldn't pretend the door wasn't there." She looked down at the child. "You did the floor, Tomas, all the way down. Your sister was right about you." The boy was quiet a moment. Then in the corridor tongue, small, "When we get somewhere, a real somewhere, will you help me find her? You know how to go places nobody watches. You could find anybody." "I could," Mara said. "I will." She said it the way she said everything, flat, a fact laid on a table, and it landed heavier for the flatness, because a promise made without heat is a promise a sable child could believe. "Somewhere real first, then your sister, then the next transport and the one after that, because there's always a next transport, and I've got a thing behind my ears now that they meant for a cage and I've decided to use for a door." She put one hand on the boy's shoulder briefly and took it away. "Go sit with the scarred man. Tell him you're the bravest one in the shelter. He'll believe you. He watched you do the floor." Voss flew until the lane had them, and then the crawler's guidance took the burden of the flight, and he let 2 of his hands come off the controls, and he found that the small woman had crossed the hold and crouched beside the pilot rest, and was looking at his chest with the flat assessing attention of a person who had seen a great many injuries in a corridor, and had learned to sort the survivable from the not. "The Kesh cracked something," she said. "It was not a question." "Several somethings. I'll manage. I'm a surgeon. I know exactly which of my own bones I can ignore." He said it dry, and it cost him, and she almost smiled and filed the almost. "You came back for me," Voss said. "You had the child aboard and the ramp closing, and you came back across the deck for the man who built you a cage. That was not the arithmetic. That was a feeling. I thought you didn't deal in those." "Doors don't get left," Mara said. "That's not a feeling, that's a rule. The corridor teaches it early. You leave the ones who held the door, and next time nobody holds it." She looked at him a moment longer, at the gray, careful alien who had chosen, at the last, the more expensive thing. "You could have run in the hour before first light. You built the whole thing so you wouldn't have to be there when it happened, and then you were there anyway, holding the seal where everyone could see. Why?" Voss was quiet, flying, watching the lane. "Because for 10 years I told myself the not watching was innocent," he said finally. "That I only built the thing, and other men decided what it was for, and my hands were clean because they only ever did the surgery. And then I watched them shove a child off a transport, and I understood that a man who builds the cage and looks away while they load it is not a man with clean hands. He's just a man who never has to see them dirty." He set his last free hand against his cracked chest. You made me see them. I'd rather be a door with dirty hands than a wall with clean ones. It turns out that was always the choice, and I'd been pretending it was a different one for a decade. The crawler ran the lane, out and away, and behind it the loom shrank to a bright point and then to nothing, and ahead the neutral port grew, and the 11 Sable who were no longer stock rode in the cramped hold of a stolen medical evac toward a somewhere real, carried there by a surgeon with dirty hands and a small calm woman who had decided that down was a door. The neutral port was called Havoc's Transit, and its chief arbiter was a four-armed scholar of the Theory named Corin Ash, and she had spent 19 years learning to keep her secondary lid still while people lied to her, and she had never once before that week had to keep them still while she watched a truth she could not classify. The truth was on the dock footage, which had come to her along with everything else the Meridian Concord had broadcast across half the reach, a courtesy the Guild had not intended and could not now withdraw. Arbiter Ash watched the footage in her chamber with the sound off, and then with the sound on and then with the sound off again, and each time she reached the same place, which was a small woman coming down 30 meters of vertical wall onto the man who ran the facility, and each time she failed to write, in the box her report required her to fill, the category the event belonged to. It was not an escape. She had adjudicated escapes. Escapes were frantic, and this was not frantic. It was not a mutiny. There had been no violence to speak of, no dead, not even the overseer, whom the footage showed being held down and then let up and then simply stepped away from. It was not a rescue in any form her law recognized, because the person affecting it had been the merchandise. Arbiter Ash had a form for a fleet answering a distress call, and a form for a soldier claiming a hostile world, and a form for a great many kinds of force applied at a great many scales, and she had no form at all for a small deathworlder who had defeated an entire facility by declining calmly to accept its arithmetic, and by making the smart move for every one of its officers, one at a time, be to let her go. "You built the augmentation," she said to the surgeon, who sat across from her with his chest bound and 2 of his 4 hands resting carefully in his lap. "Describe for the record what you built." "I rebuilt a human sense of balance," Voss said. "The vestibular sense, the thing that tells a body which way is down. I built it better than it had been." That was the whole of the procedure. Everything else she did with it, she did herself. "Better how?" Voss was quiet a moment, choosing. "Every other species I ever augmented, I gave a better answer to the question which way is down. She was the first who took the improvement and used it to ask a different question, not which way is down, but which way do I need down to be." He met the arbiter's still secondary lids. "I did not build that. I built a good inner ear. She brought the different question with her. It came off the death world in her, the same as the small frame and the fast adaptation. I only gave it something to work with, and it turned out the thing it wanted to work with was every wall and ceiling in my facility." Arbiter Ash looked down at the box on her form she still had not filled. The Concord's records suggest the intent was to open her, to map the mechanism. The intent was to open her, yes, and it would not have worked, and I told them so, and the reason it would not have worked is in your footage. Voss nodded at the frozen image of the small woman on the wall. "The mechanism they wanted to map isn't in the parts I built. It's in the question she brought. You cannot cut a question out of a body. You can only kill the body that was asking it and get, for your trouble, a corpse and a mystery, which is precisely the trade the overseer was about to make when she declined it for him." He paused. "You won't find a category for her, Arbiter. I've watched you fail to for the last hour. There isn't one. That's the thing the Concord never understood about the Sable stock, and it's the thing that ruined them. They kept trying to file a thing that files itself under nothing." The Meridian Augmentation Concord did not fall in a battle. It fell in a series of quiet withdrawals, each one a floor-bound officer somewhere doing, alone at his own desk, the arithmetic the woman had done out loud. The Farron factor withdrew first, and publicly, because Sesh Farinalo was a functionary of a shipping combine, and a shipping combine lives and dies by its name on manifests. And the manifest the Conquered had just broadcast to the entire reach had the Farron Combine's name on it as the client for a line of 40 deathworlders to be built off a mapped and murdered subject. Farinalo did not withdraw out of conscience. He withdrew out of the same cold calculation the cutter captains had made, which was that the last client standing next to the Meridian Conquered, when the port authorities finished reading the records, would be the client whose name was easiest to reach. He filed a withdrawal and a disavowal and a statement, and in the statement, which Arbiter Ash read 3 times, because it was the closest thing to awe she ever got out of a functionary, he wrote a single sentence that was not required and that no lawyer would have advised. I was shown a body that walked the inside of a sphere in null gravity with no rail and no clip, and I understood that I had come to buy a tool, and I left understanding that I had been looking at a person, and I find I would prefer not to have my name near what was done to persons on that station. The other clients followed, each for his own cold reason. The port authorities impounded the loom. Overseer Neth Calorum was taken into arbitration custody, where he was, by every account, perfectly composed and perfectly cooperative, and perfectly unable to explain why a system he had built to be unbeatable had been beaten by a subject who never once raised her voice. He kept returning, in his testimony, to the fairness of the trade he had offered on the dock, as though the fairness were a defense, as though he still did not understand that the fairness had been the exact thing she used against him, that a woman who deals in situations will take your fair trade and keep only the true half of it. Arbiter Ash listened to a great deal of that testimony, and filed a great deal of it, and never did fill the box on her original form, and eventually she wrote in it, against all her training, 3 words that were not a category and were the truest thing in the entire record. She changed the arithmetic. And the surgeon, Ale Voss, whose credential was on the broadcast study and could never be unattached from it, was not charged, because the arbiter found that a man who confesses his own crime to the entire reach on his own authority in the act of undoing it occupies a position her law had also never built a form for, and she declined to invent one to his disadvantage. He was instead released, with a bound chest and a ruined career and a thing behind his own eyes that had not been there before, which was the clean feeling of a man who had finally paid for the thing he built, and found the price survivable, and found himself, for the first time in a decade, able to look at his own 4 hands. Mara did not stay for the arbitration. She stayed exactly long enough to see the 11 settled, to see the broad-scarred man given a bunk and a work chit, and a name on a registry that was not a unit number, to see the woman he'd carried down the rail stop flinching when a door cycled, to see Tomas fed and washed and asleep somewhere that locked from the inside instead of the out. And then, on the 3rd night at Havoc's transit, she went to the surgeon's recovery room and stood in the doorway, the door, not the corner. She had stopped needing the corner with him and told him she was leaving. "The arbiter will want you," Voss said. "You're the whole case. The arbiter has your footage and your confession and Calorum's testimony. She doesn't need me and I'd be no use to her. I don't have a category either." Mara leaned in the doorway. "There's a transport that came off the Sable Corridor 2 weeks after mine. Tomas's sister was on the list for it. The Conquered logged her. She's real. She's in the impound manifest. She's on the loom right now with the rest of the stock the port authority hasn't finished processing out. And the port authority is slow and careful and floor-bound, and it will get to her in a month, maybe 2, and a month is a long time to be a child in an impounded facility full of frightened guards who just watched their whole world end." She straightened. "I'm not waiting a month. I told Tomas I'd find her. Doors don't get left. Neither do the ones behind the doors." "You're going back to the loom." Voss said it flatly, understanding it. "Into an impounded station under Port Authority guard to pull one child out of a processing queue, alone." It's an impounded station full of floor-bound guards who don't know yet that the walls aren't a law, Mara said. It's the easiest building I've ever been asked to walk. The hard one was the one where they were expecting me and I'd never done it before. This one, nobody's expecting anything, and I've done it once already. She almost smiled, and this time she let it reach the edge of her level ordinary face and stay there a second before she filed it. You gave me a good inner ear, Surgeon. I'm going to go on asking it the different question until there's nobody left in a box who wants out. That's the situation. It was always going to be the situation from the first night, when I put my hand on a wall that didn't feel like a wall and understood what they'd actually built me. Voss looked at her a long moment from the recovery bed, the small, calm, impossible thing he had made and been unmade by, and he did the last surgery of the whole affair, which was to let her go without one word of caution, because caution was a wall, and he had decided which of those he was. When you find her, he said, bring her here. The Arbiter's building a registry for the ones with no category. It's a poor thing, a start of a thing, but it locks from the inside. He paused. And Mara. The next time they build one of you and call it a gift, because they will, someone always will, the corridor never closes and the arithmetic always looks good on a slate, teach them what you taught the conquered. Not with a fleet, not with a fire. Just walk out the direction they never guarded in front of everyone so they can't pretend the direction isn't there. That's the plan, she said. It was always the plan. And she pushed off the doorframe and was gone down a corridor she would leave by whatever surface carried her, and Voss lay in the recovery bed at Havoc's transit and listened to her go and did not hear her feet, because there was nothing to hear. Because a thing that can walk where no one is looking makes no sound in the direction of up. The loom under Impound was a different building than the loom under the Conquered, and the difference was fear. Mara came back to it the way she had left it, along the surfaces no one guarded, and she found a station that had lost its arithmetic. The Conquered's crews were gone or confined. In their place the Port Authority had put a caretaker garrison, a mixed detachment, floor-bound all of it, drawn from 3 neutral worlds and thrown together too fast to trust each other, tasked with holding an impounded station full of impounded people, until the slow, careful machinery of arbitration got around to sorting the guilty from the merchandise. They were nervous. Nervous men on a station they didn't know, guarding a population they'd been told was deathworlder stock, in the shadow of a broadcast that had shown the whole reach what one of that stock could do. They watched the doors, and they watched the floors, and Mara went over their heads through galleries gone dim with power down, and none of them learned in the whole of the night that she was there. She found the Impound manifest first, because a person who deals in situations gets the manifest before she gets moving. It was on an unsecured caretaker terminal in the old administration tier. The Port Authority had not yet gotten around to changing the Conquered's careless security, which was the kind of thing a slow, careful bureaucracy never got around to until after it mattered. And she read it braced across the ceiling above the terminal, upside down in the dim light, and she found the entry. Nea Sable Stock, Transport Corridor Second Acquisition. Age 9, holding Gallery 4, Subject Cluster East. Tomas's sister was on the loom, and she was 9 years old, and she was in a holding gallery 2 wheels away from where Mara hung reading her name, and between the two of them were 40 nervous floor-bound guards who had all seen the broadcast, and none of whom would think to look up. Holding Gallery 4 had been a frame chamber once, a smaller cousin of the great null sphere, and the Port Authority had filled it with cots and frightened people, and a single locked door with 2 guards on it, and it was the easiest room Mara had walked since the corridor. She did not go through the door. She went through the frame. The gallery's old structural ribs still ran the walls and the ceiling, the bones of a chamber built to test bodies in low gravity, and Mara moved along them above the cots in the dim power-down light while 80 frightened sables slept or failed to sleep below her, and she found the child by the thing that had marked Tomas, which was that the child was awake, sitting up on a cot with her back to the wall and her knees drawn up, watching the room the way corridor children watched every room. A beat ahead of where a child should be. Mara came down the wall beside the cot, slow, quiet, hands open, and crouched so her face was level with the girl's, and spoke in the corridor tongue, flat and low, the voice that promised nothing it couldn't deliver. "Naya," she said. The girl's head snapped around. "Don't make noise. I came off the corridor like you. Your brother sent me." The girl went very still, the animal stillness of a child deciding whether a thing in the dark is a rescue or a worse trap. "Tomas is dead," she said. "They took him. The chime. Everybody the chime took is dead. That's what the crews said." "The crews lied. That's what crews do." Mara held up one hand slow and turned it so the dim light caught the faint scar at her own hairline. "Tomas did the floor all the way down a station on a cargo rail 300 meters over open space, and he never once looked at the drop. And when the big guard grabbed his arm, he didn't cry. He waited, because he trusted somebody was 9 feet up dealing with it. He's asleep right now on a port 3 jumps out in a room that locks from the inside, and the last thing he asked me before I left was, would I come find you?" She lowered the hand. "He said you told him he was the bravest one in the shelter. He's been trying to still be that the whole time. Now it's your turn. I need the bravest one in the shelter to do a hard thing quietly. Can you?" Naya looked at the small, calm woman crouched beside her cot in the dark, and did the arithmetic of a 9-year-old who had already learned that hope was expensive, and spent it anyway, because the woman had known about the chime and the crew's lie and the exact shape of her brother, and no trap that Naya had ever heard of came baited with a truth that specific. "What's the hard thing?" she whispered. "You walk where I tell you when I tell you on the floor while I work the ceiling," Mara said. "Same as your brother. And you don't wake the others not because they don't deserve waking, but because 80 people moving at once wakes the guards, and I can only take you tonight, quiet, through the seam. The others get out the slow way, the safe way, the arbitration way in a month, when the port authority processes them home. You're the one who can't wait a month because you're 9 and you're in a framed chamber and I made a promise to your brother. Do you understand the difference? I'm not leaving them. I'm coming back for them the way the law comes back, slow and boring and certain. I'm taking you the way I take the ones who can't wait." The girl was quiet. Then she put her small feet on the cold floor of the framed chamber, and stood, and looked up first thing. Up, the way her brother had, at the dim seam of the old structural ribs, where a woman off the corridor was already rising back into the bones of the room. "Floor," Naya whispered to herself, like a thing to hold on to. "You do the ceiling." They went out through the seam the port authority had never learned to guard, and it took the better part of an hour, and it was the least dramatic hour of the whole affair, and that was exactly how Mara wanted it. She moved the child through the power-down galleries the way she had moved 11 people through the amber-lit corridor, a beat at a time, floor and ceiling, the girl walking where she was told and the woman above her taking away, silently and in advance, every place a guard might have been. Twice she had to hold, once for a caretaker patrol that came through a junction floor level and passed beneath her without one of its 4 members thinking to raise his eyes, once for a nervous sentry at a hatch who almost looked up, and didn't, because looking up was still not a thing his body had learned to do even after the broadcast had told him in plain words that it should. Fear had made the garrison watchful. It had not made them able to watch the one direction that mattered, because that was not a thing fear could teach in a night. It was a thing you had to be built for, or born on a world that built it into you, and the port authority's mixed floor-bound garrison had been neither. At the ventral freight dock, the same dock, swept and sealed for real this time, its outer bay closed, a single caretaker skiff moored at its lock, Mara stopped at the edge of the deck and crouched beside the girl in the dark and did the last quiet arithmetic. "There's a skiff," she said, "Port Authority small fueled." It authorizes to a caretaker hand, which I don't have, but it's got a manual undock for exactly the kind of emergency where the caretaker's hand isn't available, because they always build the manual override for the emergency and then forget they built it. She almost smiled, filed it. One caretaker on the lock. Floor bound. I take the lock, you take the skiff hatch. We're undocked before the garrison finishes deciding whether the thing that just happened was real. Then we ride to Havoc's and I put you in a room with your brother that locks from the inside. She looked down at the child. Last piece of floor, Naya. Then no more floor for you either. Ready? The girl nodded. Once level, a sable adult's nod trapped in a 9-year-old. And Mara Quill took the lock the way she took everything, from the direction no one guarded, exactly waited, no anger in it. The caretaker on the deck removed from his post and set down unhurt before he understood that a post could be removed from, and the manual undock cycled. And the skiff came off the loom's ventral lock quiet as a held breath, and the impounded station shrank behind it, bright and enormous, and finally, for the first time in a decade, holding no child who could not wait. The reunion at Havoc's Transit was not a loud thing, because they were sable and loud things were expensive. But Arbiter Corin Ash watched it from the doorway of the registry hall and understood that she was seeing the truest classification anyone would ever make of the case she could not file. The girl came off the skiff behind the small woman, thin and wary, and the boy came across the registry hall too fast and then stopped a body length short, the way corridor children stopped short, because reaching for a thing too fast was how you learned it wasn't real. And the two of them stood a body length apart in the middle of the hall and looked at each other, and neither of them cried, and then Tomas said, in the corridor tongue, "You were on the transport list. I did the arithmetic." I thought, and Naya said, "The crews lied about the chime," and Tomas said, "She told me. She said she'd find you." And only then did the body length close, and the two of them held on to each other in the middle of the registry hall in the flat, undramatic way of people who had learned to spend joy as carefully as fear. Mara did not watch it. She had turned away to the registry terminal to log the girl into a name and not a number, and Arbiter Ash noted that too, that the woman who deals in situations did the paperwork rather than watch the payoff, because watching the payoff was a feeling and the paperwork was a door, and she had decided a long time ago which of those she was. "You brought a child off an impounded station under my garrison's guard," Ash said, crossing to her. "Do you know how many forms that is?" "Your garrison's floor-bound," Mara said, not looking up from the terminal. "It's not a criticism, it's a manifest fact. You put 40 guards who watch doors and floors on a station whose most dangerous asset walks the ceiling, and then you were surprised the ceiling wasn't covered. Cover the ceiling next time and I won't be able to embarrass you." She finished the entry. Naya, registry name, no unit number. The other 80 in Gallery 4 and the rest of the stock across the loom, you process them home the slow way. All of them. I checked the manifest against the corridor logs, and there's 160 living people in that station who got bought and shipped and augmented and caged. And every one of them has a name that isn't a number. And I want your word that the slow, careful, boring machinery gets to every single one before your garrison's nerve runs out, and somebody does something stupid to a frightened room. "You have it," Ash said. "It was always going to get to them. You only took the one because the one couldn't wait." The one couldn't wait. Mara turned from the terminal at last and looked at the Arbiter with the level, ordinary eyes that the whole Reach had now seen come down a wall onto an overseer. "That's the whole of it, Arbiter. That's the situation, start to finish. You keep looking for a bigger thing to file me under. There isn't one. There's just the ones who can't wait I take now, the direction nobody guards. The ones who can wait the law takes slow. And the ones building the cages find out, one at a time in front of everybody, that the cage had a door in the one direction they never learned to look. Write that in your box if you need a box. It's true and it fits." The rest of the loom came home the slow way, exactly as promised, and Arbiter Ash made it her business to see that it did. It took 4 months. It was boring and careful, and it generated a great deal of paper, and not one line of it made a broadcast anywhere in the reach, because the slow, careful freeing of 160 people is not a thing that trends the way a woman coming down a wall trends. But at the end of the 4 months there was no one left in a cage on the loom, and the station itself was condemned and cut up for salvage, and the metal that had been a facility for turning deathworlders into merchandise was melted down and became, among other things, the frame of the registry hall's new east wing, which Arbiter Ash found fitting in a way she did not put in any form. The Farron Combine paid a settlement it did not have to pay, because Sesh Farinalo's unrequired sentence about persons had become a thing the Combine's own people quoted at each other, and a Combine that has started quoting its own conscience at itself is a Combine that has become, quietly, a slightly better thing than it was. Overseer Neth Calorum was found, by the arbitration, to have committed no single act her law could name, and to have committed the whole of a decade of acts her law had simply never been built to see, and she did the only thing left, which was to strip him of every authority he had ever held and enter him into a registry of his own, a list of the ones who deal in situations and never once ask what the situation is, and release him, uncaged, into a reach that had read the records and would never again put a seal in his hand. It was not a punishment her law recognized. It was the exact punishment the man had earned, which was to go on being precisely what he was in a galaxy that now knew it. And the surgeon, Ael Voss, healed and did not leave. He had thought he would. He had thought a man with a ruined career and a confessed decade of crime would want to go as far from augmentation as a body could travel. But Arbiter Ash had built a registry for the ones with no category, and the registry had become a hall, and the hall had become a place where the freed stock of a dozen corridors came to be logged into names, and a great many of them arrived carrying augmentations that had been built into them as cages. Better eyes for a mine, stronger hands for a hull, a rebuilt sense of balance for a labor line, and a great many of those augmentations were killing their owners slowly. Because a cage built into a body does not stop being a cage when the body walks free. They needed a surgeon. They needed, specifically, a surgeon who understood exactly how these things were built, because he had built them, and who would now spend the rest of his career taking the cage out of the gift and leaving the person the gift behind. Voss took the post. He set up his instruments in a clean, bright room in the east wing that had been made from the melted-down bones of the loom, and he spent his days undoing, one careful procedure at a time, the exact kind of work he had spent a decade doing, and he found that his hands, which had never once shaken while building a cage, did not shake taking one out either, and that the not shaking meant something different now, and that the difference was the whole of what he had gone through everything to earn. He did not augment Nea. She had asked him to. She had watched what the gift had made of the woman who saved her brother, and she had wanted it, the way children want the thing that saved them. And Voss had told her no, gently in the clean, bright room, the way a surgeon tells a truth that a scalpel cannot. The woman who brought you here didn't ask for what I built into her, he said. They did it to her to sell her, and she took the thing they meant as a cage and turned it into a door, and that is a rare and costly thing, and it cost her more than you can see. You have the door already, Nea. Every sable child does. It's the different question, which way do I need down to be? You brought it off the corridor the same as she did. You don't need me to cut you open to give you a thing you were already born asking. He put his instruments away. Grow up first. Grow all the way up. And if, when you're grown, you still want to walk the direction no one guards, come back and we'll talk, and it'll be your asking and not theirs. That's the only kind of gift worth having, the kind you asked for. Mara came back to Havoc's between corridors, which was the only schedule she kept. She did not stay. Staying was a wall, and she had a thing behind her ears that she had decided long ago to use as a door, and the corridors never closed, and there was always a next transport, and a next facility that had done the arithmetic on a slate, and found that a deathworlder body took the lattice better than anything in the catalog. She went where the ones who couldn't wait were, and she took them the direction no one guarded, and she brought them to the hall in the east wing, and Voss took the cages out of the ones who'd been caged, and Ash logged them into names, and the slow, careful Law came behind for the ones who could wait, and between the three of them and the small woman who would not stay, a thing grew at Havoc's transit that had no category either, and did not need one. She always saw the children before she left. That was the one wall she kept. She would find Tomas and Nea wherever they were in the growing hall, in the schoolroom the freed stock had built, most often, because the two of them had decided, with the flat certainty of corridor children, that the thing they wanted to grow up to do was the thing that had been done for them. And she would sit with them a while, and say little because saying little was her way, and they had learned to read the little she said the way they read everything, a beat ahead. "You're leaving again," Tomas said, the last time, which was not the last time but was the time that Voss, watching from the door of his clean, bright room, would remember as the one that told him what the whole affair had finally made. "There's a corridor," Mara said. "There's always a corridor." "When we're grown," Nea said, "we're coming with you, both of us, to do the sealing." Mara looked at the two of them a long moment, the two corridor children who had learned, from a woman who dealt in situations, that a situation could be changed. And she did not tell them no, and she did not tell them the cost, because they had already paid a piece of it and would pay the rest with their eyes open, the way she had, and that was the only honest way anyone ever came to the work. "When you're grown," she said, "and when it's your asking and not mine and not theirs," she stood. "Do the floor until then, both of you, grow all the way up, the ceiling'll still be there, it's always there. That's the thing nobody ever learns until it's too late for them and just in time for us." She put a hand briefly on each small head and took it away, and went to the door where the surgeon stood. The story got out ahead of her, which was the one thing Mara never planned and could not have stopped. It went the way corridor stories went, mouth to mouth, transport to transport, told in the flat clipped sable dialect that the processing crews couldn't parse and had never bothered to learn. It changed in the telling, the way all such stories change. In some versions she came down a wall of fire, in some she took 100 guards apart, in some she was 10 feet tall. Mara heard a few of them, at ports, told by people who did not know she was the woman in the story, and she never corrected them, because the true version was smaller and colder and more useful than any of the tall ones, and she had learned that a story does its work by the shape of it and not the size, and the shape of this one was doing exactly the work she needed. The work it did was this: the facilities began to hesitate. Arbiter Ash was the first to notice it, because noticing patterns in the movement of stock was the whole of her office, and she saw the corridor traffic change over the year that followed. The acquisitions off the sable bracket slowed. Not from law, the law was slow and boring, and had reached only the meridian conquered, and there were a dozen other guilds who did the same work under other names. It slowed because the guilds themselves had read the records, and heard the corridor stories, and done the cold arithmetic that guilds do, and found a new figure in the ledger that had not been there before. The figure of what it costs to build a cage into a body that might, it turned out, be exactly the kind of body that walks out the direction you never guarded and puts your entire client list in front of the port authority on your own broadcast channel. It was not conscience that slowed them. Ash was too old to believe in a galaxy converted by conscience. It was arithmetic, the same cold arithmetic the whole affair had ever run on, only now with a new cost entered into it, the cost of the thing that comes down the wall. The sable stock had gone, in the space of a year, from the best value in the catalog to the one line no careful buyer wanted his name near, and the reason was a small, calm woman who had never once raised her voice, and who had changed the arithmetic not for herself, but for every deathworlder the corridor had not yet reached, by the simple procedure of showing an entire reach, in front of everyone, what one of them could do with a gift that was meant as a cage. "You've made them afraid to build it," Ash said to Voss, in the clean, bright room in the East Wing, watching the corridor traffic thin on her display. "Not by threatening them, by existing, by making the smart move for every guild be to leave the sable brackets alone." "She'd tell you that's not fear," Voss said, not looking up from the instrument he was cleaning. "She'd tell you it's just the arithmetic, that none of them were ever the thing she was angry at, that she changed the situation and the situation changed them. She's very precise about it." He set the instrument down. "But yes, they're afraid to build it. A decade I spent building cages and calling them gifts, and the thing that finally made them stop was one gift that turned out to be a door, and the door didn't threaten anyone. It just walked out where they could all see, so they couldn't pretend the door wasn't there." He almost smiled, the dry Cytherea near smile she had come to know. "I built the best cage of my career, Arbiter, and it freed 160 people and closed half the corridors in the Reach, and I did all of that by getting one thing wrong. I'd get it wrong again. I'd get it wrong every day for the rest of my life." She left on a gray morning between corridors, the way she always left. Voss walked her as far as the East Wing lock, which was as far as he ever walked her, because past it she went the way he could not follow, and they had both long since stopped pretending otherwise. The two children came to the lock too, taller now, both of them, growing all the way up the way she told them to, the boy nearly to Mara's shoulder and the girl not far behind, and they did not ask to come, because they had learned that when it was their asking and not hers the answer would change, and it was not their asking yet. "There's a facility off the Ummick corridor," Mara said at the lock. "New name, old work. They've bought Sable stock, 3 transports, the manifest says, though the manifest lies. They think the story's just a story. They think the direction nobody guards is a thing that happened once on the loom to a guild that was careless." She checked the fit of the plain gray kit she carried, which held almost nothing, because she had learned in the corridor that a person who deals in situations travels light and improvises the rest. "So I'm going to go be careless at them, in front of everybody." "Bring them here," Voss said. "However many can't wait, the hall's got room. It's got more room every month. We keep building it out of the metal they cut the last facility up for." He paused and did the thing he had learned to do from her, which was to say the true thing flatly without heat so it would land. "And Mara, you've been doing this a year now alone, the direction no one guards. One day you'll come down a wall onto a facility that's read the records and thought about the ceiling and covered it. One day the arithmetic changes on you, too." "I know," Mara said. She said it the way she said everything, a fact laid on a table, no weight on it she didn't intend. "That's the situation. It was always going to be the situation. A thing that goes where no one's looking works right up until the day somebody looks, and then it's just a small woman in a room full of people who were expecting her." She looked at him, level, ordinary, the same face he had first seen through observation glass in a dark chamber, doing what it always did, which was counting. "But that's not today, and it's not the Ummick corridor, because they think it's a story. And every day it isn't today, there's somebody who can't wait, and I can go get them the direction nobody's watching yet. That's a good trade, surgeon. Better than good. I'll keep making it until the day the arithmetic changes, and then I'll have made it 1,000 times, and 1,000 people will be logged into names instead of numbers, and that's a fine thing for a piece of merchandise to be able to say it did." She said it dry, giving him back the overseer's own words turned inside out, and Voss recognized them, and did not smile, because some things are too true to smile at. She went out the lock, and she did not go down the boarding corridor to the transit ring where the ships were, the way a floor-bound traveler would. She went up. Voss watched her do it, the way he had watched her do it the first night in his suite, folded into the join of the wall and the ceiling, at home in the one direction his whole species had spent its history forgetting to watch. She set one hand flat against the bright metal of the east wing wall, metal that had been a cage and was now a hall, and her weight found it, and reassigned to it, and the wall became a floor she happened to be standing next to, and she walked up it, unhurried, into the structural bones of the station and the service galleries above, toward whatever surface would carry her to whatever ship would take her to the corridor, and the two children watched her go with their faces turned up, growing all the way up. Learning the one thing the surgeon had finally learned, which was that up was a place you could stand if you were built to ask the different question. She did not look back, because looking back was a wall, and she had decided a long time ago which of those she was. Voss stood at the lock a while after she had gone in the gray morning light, with the two corridor children beside him, and he thought about the needle in the integration rig on the first day, pinned at the top of its range, refusing to come down, and about the thing he had said to his assistant in the frightened hour after log the phase, nothing else, not one word past that, as though a thing that extraordinary could be logged and filed and kept in a box. They had meant to build her a better sense of which way was down. They had succeeded. That was the part no one in the whole ruin of the conquered ever quite absorbed. The surgery had worked. The gift was real. They had given a human the finest sense of balance the catalog had ever produced, an absolute and perfect knowledge of where every surface was and which way it pulled, and she had taken it, and looked at it, and thanked them by teaching an entire reach that down was the one thing they never should have assumed they controlled. The children went into the schoolroom, eventually, to do the floor a while longer. Voss went back to his clean, bright room, to the slow work of taking cages out of gifts, which was the only work he wanted now, and the only kind that let a man look at his own hands. And somewhere out along the corridor, a new facility that thought the story was just a story went on with its careful arithmetic, certain of its walls, certain of its floors, watching its doors, and never once thinking to watch the corner where the wall met the ceiling, where, in a night or a night close to it, something small and calm and entirely unimpressed would be folded into the angle they had forgotten to guard, at home in the one direction they had never learned to look, counting.